You think ground beef is just burgers and meatloaf? Think again. In the 1970s, families stretched a single pound of hamburger into meals that fed six, born from tight budgets and endless creativity. Let's dig into 3 hours of 100 cheap ground beef recipes you need to eat in your lifetime. Saving bacon grease for frying beef was one of Grandma's quiet secrets for adding depth to otherwise simple meals. Whenever bacon was cooked, the fat was carefully poured into a tin or jar and kept on the counter or in the fridge. Later, when it came time to brown ground beef, she'd scoop in a spoonful, letting the smoky, savory flavor mingle with the meat. This gave even the plainest beef dishes a richness that couldn't be matched by oil or butter. It wasn't just about taste either. It was about never wasting something that could be used again. Bacon grease was considered liquid gold in many kitchens, and it flavored everything it touched. For ground beef, it was transformative, turning ordinary patties or gravies into meals that tasted indulgent. Today, we often discard bacon drippings without a thought, but back then, this was part of a cycle of cooking that made sure nothing went to waste. It's a trick that not only saved money, but also gave dishes the kind of flavor that sticks in your memory long after the meal is gone. Picnic meatloaf squares were a summer favorite long before pasta salad or grilled hot dogs took over the spotlight. You would make a basic meatloaf, ground beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasoning. Then chill it overnight, slice it into neat rectangles, and wrap them in wax paper like little parcels. They were meant to be eaten cold, straight from the cooler, with no heating, no mess, and no complaints. These squares were usually seasoned with dry onion soup mix, a heavy squirt of ketchup, and maybe a dash of Worcestershire sauce if someone was feeling bold. There was something kind of dignified about pulling one out during a picnic and eating it on a paper plate next to potato chips and lemonade. It was meatloaf without ceremony. They were practical, portable, and surprisingly tasty even without being warm. Some families packed them with pickles or thin slices of cheese on the side. Others just ate them plain, savoring the mix of meat, spice, and nostalgia. You could find recipes for these in community cookbooks with titles like Outdoor Favorites or Cold Table Classics. Ground beef and roasted maize. Enchiladas were not just a meal, they were an event. Ground beef seasoned with ancho chilies and garlic was tucked into soft tortillas made from roasted maize flour, rolled tight, and then smothered in a slow-cooked sauce that hit every note from smoky to sweet to just a little fiery. These were not the neon orange enchiladas you might find at a chain restaurant either. These were rustic, deeply flavored, and rich enough to make you forget your own name after the first bite. Served with a side of beans or a handful of fresh greens if you were feeling fancy, they were the kind of dinner that made everyone slow down and savor every bite. And if you thought roasted maize enchiladas could sweep you off your feet, just wait until you meet a dish where sage-scented beef meatballs find a new home sitting proud on a bed of buttery blue corn grits. Beef and cabbage skillet was not flashy, but it was reliable, and back in the post-war days, that counted for a lot. This dish came from the same logic that made Victory Gardens bloom and ration stamps necessary. Make the most of what you have. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and available year-round. Ground beef, when you could get it, was used sparingly. So together, they made a meal that could stretch across a week if needed. The process was simple. Brown the beef, toss in shredded or chopped cabbage, season with whatever you had, salt, pepper, vinegar, maybe a splash of soy sauce or tomato paste if you were lucky. The cabbage softened into ribbons, soaking up every bit of beefy flavor while adding its own earthy goodness. You ate it straight from the skillet, hot and steaming, with maybe a hunk of bread on the side. It was survival food that did not taste like sacrifice. And if that sounds hearty enough, just wait until we take this same idea to the great outdoors with foil, fire, and a little campfire nostalgia. Mock chop suey was America's humble imitation of faraway flavors. In small-town kitchens, especially across the Midwest, families used ground beef, cabbage, celery, and onions to create something exotic without straying from local ingredients. Soy sauce, or more often a few dashes of Worcestershire and salt, gave it the illusion of Eastern spice. Everything simmered in a thick gravy and was often served over rice or noodles. For many, it was their first taste of a world beyond their own, adapted to fit Depression-era budgets. It looked different, smelled foreign, and tasted comforting all at once. Kids loved it for its savoriness, adults for how it stretched meat across several meals. Though it began as imitation, mock chop suey became its own tradition, a dish that proved you did not need authenticity to find connection, just creativity and a good skillet. Traditional cedar smoked beef skewers were one of those dishes that proved you did not need 1,000 ingredients to create something unforgettable. Beef was marinated with just salt, pepper, and maybe a brush of honey if you were feeling wild, then threaded onto wooden sticks and slow roasted over cedar branches. The cedar smoke wrapped itself around the beef, sinking deep into every fiber, turning a simple skewer into a feast that could make even the grumpiest neighbor smile. You would find folks gathered around fire pits, laughing and trading stories while keeping an eye on their skewers, turning them every so often to get that perfect even char. There was something about the smell of cedar smoke that felt like a hug from nature itself, especially when it meant that dinner was almost ready. Kids would sneak bites straight off the sticks, adults would pile them high on plates, and nobody ever left hungry. And if you thought cedar smoke could work miracles on plain beef, wait until you see how mustard greens and ground beef teamed up for one of the most overlooked flavor combos in history. Burying food underground for natural refrigeration was one of the quiet genius moves that let Native American families survive through blistering summers and brutal winters alike. It sounds almost too simple now, but when done right, it was remarkably effective. By digging deep, shaded pits and lining them with grass, bark, or even cool stones, they created natural refrigerators that could keep vegetables crisp, fruits fresh, and even meat safer than leaving it above ground. There was an art to it, a dance with the seasons and the soil that few today remember. But the wisdom of making the earth itself your storage partner never truly faded. And when long journeys or harsh winters loomed ahead, Native chefs had another brilliant solution for keeping their people nourished on the move, mixing wild berries, nuts, and hidden energy into one of history's first real trail mixes. Hamburger spoon-bread casserole was as southern as sitting on a porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, and it brought all the heartwarming charm you would expect from something served at a 1940s church supper. Spoon-bread, for the uninitiated, is not exactly bread and not quite pudding. It is somewhere in between. It is soft, warm, and creamy, like cornbread that has decided to ditch its edges and just melt in your mouth. Now imagine that heavenly texture layered over seasoned ground beef. The beef underneath was usually cooked with onions, garlic, and a dash of pepper or hot sauce. This dish was a hug in a casserole dish, soft, savory, and so filling you might not need anything else on the plate. It was also one of those recipes that always tasted better the next day if there were leftovers at all. But if this feels too soft and cozy for your taste, let us head into something born straight from scarcity and grit. Sweet sour ground beef with pineapple was not subtle, but that is what made it shine. It was a stovetop dish you cooked in one big skillet. Ground beef browned with onions, then simmered in a mixture of pineapple chunks, vinegar, ketchup, and brown sugar. It smelled like takeout, it tasted like a tropical potluck, and it felt like a vacation, even when dinner was just in your tiny kitchen with the window cracked open. The sweetness from the pineapple and sugar mixed with the tang of vinegar to give the beef a punchy, bold flavor that clung to every grain of rice. This was the kind of dish that made kids ask for seconds, even if they did not love onions or peppers. You could find it in cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s, usually in a section called International Flair or Creative Ground Beef Dinners. It was experimental, but not in a bad way. This dish was about making something exciting with what you had. Canned pineapple, cheap beef, sugar from the pantry. That was it. Yet somehow it came together like magic. Dishes like this reminded people that food could be fun, even when times were not. Freezing raw beef mixtures was a trick that made busy days easier long before the idea of meal prep had a name. Grandma would mix ground beef with fillers like oats, rice, breadcrumbs, or shredded vegetables, shape them into loaves, patties, or meatballs, and tuck them neatly into the freezer. When dinner time came, the hardest part of the work was already done. She could pull one out, bake or fry it, and have dinner ready in no time. This habit kept food from spoiling since fresh beef could go bad quickly, but frozen mixtures stayed safe for weeks. For larger families, this preparation was essential, allowing her to adapt quickly if unexpected guests showed up or if schedules got busy. Unlike store-bought frozen dinners, these meals were homemade, hearty, and full of care. The freezer became a quiet tool of stability in kitchens where planning ahead was survival. Those little parcels of beef weren't just food. They were foresight, comfort, and reassurance that no matter what the day brought, a warm, filling meal was always just within reach. TV dinner. Salisbury steak was more than just a frozen tray. It was a weeknight ritual, a microwave miracle, and a classic in its own right. But long before it became a staple of the television tray lifestyle, there was the homemade version, and let us just say, it was something special. This dish was a blend of ground beef, breadcrumbs, egg, and onion, all shaped into thick oval patties that mimicked the feel of a fancy steak. Then came the gravy, rich, dark, and loaded with caramelized onions. Some families added mushrooms, others swore by a spoonful of ketchup or Worcestershire to deepen the flavor. The patties simmered in that sauce until they were melt-in-your-mouth tender. Served alongside buttery mashed potatoes and canned peas, it was the kind of meal that made you want to pull up a seat in front of the old tube set and settle in for the evening. Even when frozen dinners became the norm, there was something about homemade Salisbury steak that just hit differently. But if you wanted something with a southwestern soul and a little cornbread crunch, the next recipe is a true casserole classic that still holds its ground. Using charcoal powder to enhance meat flavor and aid digestion sounds almost too wild to be real, but for Native American cooks, it was a smart, practical tool built from hard-earned wisdom. After a fire burned down to pure white coals, small amounts of fine charcoal powder were sometimes sprinkled over cooking meats or even mixed into marinades. The charcoal acted as a natural purifier, absorbing toxins and helping break down tough fibers inside the meat, making it not only more flavorful but also easier on the stomach. Some healers even mixed tiny amounts into drinking water after big meals, trusting charcoal's natural ability to soothe digestion and guard against sickness. It tasted like the earth, the fire, and the sky, all wrapped up into one unforgettable bite. And if you thought using charcoal was clever, wait until you hear about how deer fat candles turned slow basting into an art form that even today's chefs can barely rival. Stuffed cabbage leaves in tomato broth were laborious to make but worth every minute. Each cabbage leaf was softened in boiling water, then wrapped around a filling of ground beef, rice, and onion. The rolls were layered in a pot and simmered in tomato broth until tender, the flavors melding into something deep and homey. Mothers and grandmothers made them in big batches, filling entire tables with their careful handiwork. It was food that required patience and love. Each roll was a gift, a symbol of care and the value of feeding others with intention. When served, the leaves fell open just enough to reveal their fragrant center, tender and glistening. The taste was savory, sweet, and quietly profound. In families that remembered hard times, stuffed cabbage was more than a meal. It was tradition, memory, and devotion all wrapped into one. The preparation was often a family ritual, older hands teaching younger ones how to roll each leaf just right, how to tuck the edges so they would hold. The smell of tomato and spice filled the kitchen for hours, turning an ordinary day into something sacred. Every pot told a story, not of luxury, but of love shared across generations. Skillet beef and chokecherry reduction was pure frontier flavor in a cast-iron pan. Ground beef was browned up until the edges got that perfect crispy sear. Then it was bathed in a chokecherry sauce that hit every part of your tongue. Sweet, tart, smoky, and just a little wild. Chokecherries were the secret weapon of prairie kitchens, gathered from scrubby trees and boiled down into thick, glossy syrups that could turn the plainest meat into something you would remember for the rest of your life. When that sauce hit the beef, It clung to it like a second skin, soaking into every nook and cranny and making each bite better than the last. And if you thought beef and berries were an unbeatable team, just wait until you take a trip back to the school lunchrooms of old, where cornmeal-dusted beef patties ruled supreme and second helpings were a battleground. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. Pineapple beef bake was a casserole that felt like a luau in your oven. It came straight out of the 1960s, when tiki culture had Americans decking out their living rooms with bamboo furniture and sipping drinks with paper umbrellas. In that same spirit, someone decided to toss ground beef into the mix, and the result was surprisingly delicious. You would brown the beef, stir in soy sauce, onions, and bell peppers, then layer it into a casserole dish with pineapple chunks, usually canned, syrup and all. The pineapple gave it a tropical tang that cut through the richness of the beef, while the soy sauce and aromatics grounded it in something warm and familiar. It was quirky, no doubt, but it had personality. It stood out on a table full of casseroles, and for a while, it was the kind of dish that brought smiles, and maybe a hula dance or two. But if you think pineapple was a bold move, wait until ground beef went from casserole filler to party centerpiece. The macaroni beef ring was more than just a recipe, it was a showpiece. You took cooked elbow macaroni and ground beef, mixed it with eggs and tomato sauce, and pressed the whole thing into a ring mold. After it baked and set, you flipped it onto a serving plate, and there it stood, a golden brown pasta wreath. But the real drama came next. The center of the ring was filled with creamed peas, buttered corn, or even leftover stew if that is what you had. It was the kind of dinner that turned heads at church potlucks or family dinners. Kids would laugh, adults would smile politely, and everyone would eat it anyway because it was surprisingly good. The pasta held together just enough to slice, and the beef gave it weight and flavor. Sometimes there was cheese mixed in, sometimes it was just seasoned with onion powder and salt. Either way, it was a clever use of pantry staples and leftover meat. Pan frying with a touch of vinegar was one of those small but effective tricks that made a big difference in flavor. When frying ground beef, a splash of vinegar cut through the grease and brightened the overall taste. It kept the dish from feeling too heavy and added a subtle tang that balanced the richness of the meat. This trick was particularly useful for skillet meals or gravies, where the beef could easily overwhelm the other flavors. The vinegar acted as a secret seasoning, lifting the dish without anyone realizing what had been added. It was also a way to tenderize the meat slightly, making it more enjoyable to eat. Families didn't question why the beef tasted better, they just knew it did. Today, we think of vinegar mostly as a salad ingredient, but back then, it had a place in everyday cooking as well. This was one of those clever touches that showed Grandma's instinct for flavor, proof that she didn't need fancy spices or complex recipes to elevate a meal. All it took was a splash of something simple to turn an ordinary pan of beef into something unexpectedly memorable. Beefy rice-stuffed peppers were one of the more colorful dishes to come out of budget cooking. Bright bell peppers were hollowed out and filled with a mixture of cooked white rice, browned ground beef, diced onions, and canned tomato sauce. Everything got packed tight and placed upright in a baking dish, then simmered slowly in tomato broth until the peppers turned soft and sweet. It was a one-pan miracle that looked fancier than it actually was. Before wild rice and quinoa became household staples, plain white rice was the backbone of most dinner tables. It made the meat stretch farther and absorbed all the flavor. These stuffed peppers were part comfort, part presentation, and part good housekeeping. They made use of odds and ends from the fridge and felt like something you could serve to guests or just eat cold the next day. Sometimes they were topped with breadcrumbs or cheese. Sometimes they were plain. Either way, they filled the plate and the belly. You might not find them often now, but there was a time when they were everywhere, from potlucks to picnics, from lunch boxes to leftover nights. They were flavorful, practical, and proud of being a little bit extra. Potato nest casserole was one of those meals that made dinner feel fun, even when it was just a regular Tuesday. Moms across America loved this dish in the 1950s and 1960s because it combined two unbeatable dinner champions, potatoes and ground beef, into something playful, presentable, and most importantly, practical. You started by shredding potatoes, usually by hand, and seasoning them with salt, pepper, and maybe a little egg to help them hold together. Then you packed those shredded spuds into muffin tins or small ramekins, pressing the centers down to form little nests. After a quick bake, those nests crisped up around the edges and stayed soft inside. That was when the real fun began. Into each one went a scoop of ground beef, browned with onions, and seasoned to your liking. Some added peas or corn to the meat mixture, while others spooned in tomato sauce or gravy. Back into the oven they went until everything was hot and bubbling. The result was a golden brown, savory, bite-sized dinner that looked as good as it tasted. But if presentation was not your thing, and all you wanted was pure, unfiltered comfort food, the next dish takes you straight back to the heart of the American living room. Deer fat candles were one of the most imaginative and resourceful ways Native American cooks kept their meats tender and richly flavored over long, slow roasts. After rendering down the fat from deer or elk, they would form simple candles, which were set up to drip slowly over roasting meat on open spits or stone racks. As the fat melted, it would baste the meat continuously, keeping it moist, savory, and infused with a deep, wild flavor that no bottled sauce or glaze could ever match. This technique did not just make the food taste better, it helped preserve it longer, coating the meat with protective fat layers that held in moisture and kept bacteria at bay. But when it came to baking bread, Native cooks had another kind of magic altogether, capturing the very air itself to make dough rise without a single packet of yeast. Cabbage and bean soup was the workingman's dinner, a pot full of nourishment that cost next to nothing. Cabbage gave it sweetness, beans provided the protein, and a handful of spices made it taste like more than it was. Some used white beans. Others used pintos or lentils, whatever they had in their pantry. Everything simmered together until the beans were tender and the cabbage silky soft. The result was thick and hearty, perfect for dipping bread or biscuits. It was food that did not apologize for being simple because it had no reason to. It filled stomachs, warmed hands, and left no one hungry. It carried the faint sweetness of cabbage and the quiet depth of beans cooked slow. For many families, this was the meal that saw them through the hardest winters, proof that comfort did not have to be costly. A pot of cabbage and beans simmering on the stove was a sign that warmth still existed even when money did not. Sometimes a ham bone or spoonful of drippings was added to give it body. But even without, it tasted like care. It was humble food that made people feel seen, nourished, and safe, a reminder that generosity can live inside a single pot. Smothered ground. Beef and hominy was the kind of meal that did not just fill your plate, it filled your soul. Ground beef cooked slow and easy, seasoned with just enough spice to keep things interesting, and then tossed together with hominy so tender it almost melted in your mouth. If you have never had hominy before, just picture corn but bigger, puffier, and somehow even more satisfying. When the juices from the beef soaked into every kernel, you got a dish that was buttery, savory, and rich enough to carry you through an entire winter's night. Families back then knew that when you needed a dinner that would power you through long days and longer nights, this was it. It was not fancy food, but it was food that made you feel like you were winning at life, even when the cupboards were looking bare. Now, if you thought beef and hominy could turn a plain night into something unforgettable, Get ready to bite into a dish that brought every powwow to life with a little bit of crunch and a whole lot of heart. Cabbage and sausage stew was winter's answer to hunger. In homes where meat was precious, a single sausage could flavor an entire pot. Cabbage, onion, and potato took up the rest, slow-cooked until they soaked in every drop of smoky richness. The broth was peppery, the smell both humble and hearty. Served in thick bowls with bread, it was the kind of meal that made the world seem softer for a little while. This dish crossed cultures, found in Polish, German, and African American kitchens alike, each with its own rhythm and seasoning. It was proof that good food did not need abundance, only attention. The stew tasted better the next day, its flavors deepening as the cabbage gave up its sweetness. It was the kind of meal that asked for nothing but gave everything: warmth, comfort, and the quiet assurance that spring would come again. Cactus as a natural tenderizer sounds almost too strange to believe, but it was an everyday trick in many native kitchens. Certain varieties, like prickly pear, are packed with natural enzymes that break down tough muscle fibers in meat. By rubbing raw cactus slices over a piece of game meat or even marinating it in cactus juice, they could turn chewy, sinewy cuts into tender, flavorful meals that needed almost no extra cooking. It was pure kitchen magic, pulled straight from the harshest landscapes. In places where hunting was hard and every scrap of meat mattered, this trick was not just clever, it was survival. No waste, no frustration, just another example of how nature handed over its secrets to those who knew how to listen. The best part is that cactus does not mask the flavor of the meat. It simply softens it, letting the real richness shine through. Even today, modern chefs have started waking up to this forgotten genius. But it was not just fresh meals that mattered. When you needed to carry food across miles of wilderness, you needed another skill altogether: the incredible art of sun-drying meats under the open sky. Bunless stuffed onion burgers were like something straight out of a low-carb fever dream, but in the 1970s they were downright trendy. Back then, people were starting to think more about their diets, less bread, more vegetables, that sort of thing, but they were not about to give up ground beef. So, someone had the brilliant idea to turn onions into edible burger buns. Here is how it went. You hollowed out a whole onion, filled the center with seasoned ground beef, sometimes mixed with breadcrumbs, cheese, or egg, then sealed it up and baked it in the oven until the onion softened and the beef cooked through. The outside got golden and sweet, the inside juicy and rich. Sometimes a little tomato sauce or barbecue glaze was poured over the top, making it look fancy enough for company, but still easy enough to make on a Wednesday night. It was strange, it was bold, and it worked. These burgers were filling, full of flavor, and just different enough to be exciting. And if you thought stuffed onions were the height of beefy comfort, wait until you see what happened when mashed potatoes got paired with gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. Budget-baked spaghetti with ground beef and ketchup was not trying to fool anyone. It just wanted to get the job done. Instead of a long-simmered marinara or fancy herbs, this casserole used ketchup as the main sauce. You would brown your ground beef with onions, cook some spaghetti, and mix it all together with a generous squirt, or several, of ketchup. Some families added a splash of milk or canned soup to stretch the mix and make it creamy. Then it went into the oven with a handful of processed cheese or shredded cheddar sprinkled on top. The end result? Tangy, gooey, and undeniably comforting. It might not have won any awards, but it definitely cleared plates. It was especially popular in homes where kids were picky eaters and ketchup was already the king of the dinner table. You could make a big tray for almost nothing and still have enough left for lunch. For many families, this was the real weeknight special. It had the flavor of a fast food burger and the filling power of pasta. Cheap, cheerful, and reliable. Sometimes that is all dinner needs to be. Seasoning with celery salt was one of those overlooked tricks that quietly lifted the flavor of ground beef. Instead of using expensive spice blends, Grandma often reached for this inexpensive pantry staple. The celery flavor brought a subtle freshness that balanced the richness of beef, making simple patties, stews, or casseroles taste more complex. A small sprinkle could change the entire character of a dish, giving it depth that plain salt alone never managed. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, and it quickly became a reliable way to add variety without added cost. For many households, celery salt was a quiet hero in everyday cooking, especially when seasoning options were limited. Today, it's rarely used in beef dishes, yet its ability to brighten flavors hasn't changed. Back then, though, it was part of the rhythm of cooking, a small but meaningful touch that kept meals from ever feeling too plain or repetitive. Ground beef and peanut butter stew sounds like a dare, but it was actually a smart Depression-era solution that made a quiet return during the 1960s. You browned ground beef with onions, added canned tomatoes, and stirred in a big spoonful of peanut butter. That was it. Somehow, it worked. The peanut butter melted into the stew, giving it a nutty richness and silky texture that made it taste like something much fancier. You could serve it over rice or eat it with bread. Either way, it was filling, affordable, and shockingly good. It came from the tradition of using pantry staples to bulk up basic meals, especially when meat was scarce. Peanut butter added protein, calories, and a hint of sweetness that made the tomato stew feel like something more. Some recipes added beans or chili powder, others kept it simple. This stew was rarely written in official cookbooks. It was passed down through word of mouth or scribbled in the back pages of community newsletters. But for those who remembered it, it was unforgettable. It was the kind of recipe that taught you how to be bold, even in a tiny kitchen. Mock prime rib patties were what you made when you had champagne taste and a ground beef budget. These clever creations came about during a time when steaks were for special occasions, if at all, and home cooks needed to serve something that looked the part without draining the wallet. The trick was in the seasoning. You would take ground beef and mix it with salt, pepper, onion powder, and sometimes a hint of garlic or a dash of soy sauce. Then you shaped the mixture into thick, steak-like ovals and seared them on both sides until a crispy crust formed. The key was finishing them in the oven or in a skillet with a splash of beef broth or homemade au jus to keep them juicy and give them that steakhouse sizzle. Served with mashed potatoes or buttered peas, they looked and smelled like the real deal, enough that you might fool your taste buds for a few bites. It was a dish built on imagination and a real craving for luxury. But if savory was not enough and you liked your beef with a little sweetness, just wait until pineapple crashes this party. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine. It was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters, through long hunting trips, and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Cabbage and corned beef hash was the taste of winter's end. Around holidays, when corned beef appeared on tables, families saved every scrap. Those leftovers were chopped, fried with potatoes, onions, and cabbage, and crisped until golden brown. The skillet sizzled with the scent of salt and smoke, a reminder that even small bits could still make something hearty. It was a dish that turned thrift into pleasure, each bite salty, rich, and just sweet enough from the caramelized cabbage. Served with mustard or a fried egg, it was both breakfast and dinner, both practical and celebratory. Though modern kitchens favor convenience, that old hash carried a lesson that endures. Nothing from a good meal ever truly goes to waste. The leftovers told their own story, how families stretched a single roast into 3 meals, how every bite of meat was honored. It was food that bridged the gap between necessity and comfort, tasting of memory, resourcefulness, and satisfaction. Vintage iron skillet beef and sunflower seed hash was the kind of meal that was built to last, just like the old cast iron pans it was cooked in. Ground beef was browned until crispy on the edges, tossed with diced potatoes, onions, and handfuls of roasted sunflower seeds that added a nutty crunch you never knew you needed. It was the breakfast that kept farmers going until sunset and made kids think twice before saying they were still hungry. Skillet hash like this was not just convenient, it was genius. Everything cooked in one pan, nothing wasted, everything tasting like it had been kissed by the smoke and heat of a wood-burning stove. The sunflower seeds were the wild card, adding little bursts of flavor that turned an already great dish into something special. Some folks even tossed in a fried egg on top if they were feeling fancy. But even plain, it was a meal that tasted like hard work, fresh air, and good living. And if you think hash can fill you up and warm your soul, wait until you dive into a stew that turns ground beef and roasted pumpkin into the kind of harvest feast you will dream about. Flavoring with Worcestershire sauce may sound simple today, but for Grandma it was a genius shortcut that elevated humble beef into something richer. Just a few drops added layers of flavor that made plain ground beef taste almost like a steak. The tangy, savory depth of the sauce seeped into every bite, transforming burgers, meatloaf, and skillet meals into dishes that felt more special than their modest ingredients suggested. At a time when seasoning options were limited and spice cabinets weren't as stocked as they are now, Worcestershire was a miracle in a bottle. It was affordable, versatile, and long-lasting, which made it a kitchen essential. Families grew up on meals where that little splash of sauce was the secret no one talked about but everyone tasted. It gave ground beef a boldness that kept it from feeling repetitive, even if you ate it several times a week. Today, with so many sauces and condiments available, this old trick feels almost too simple to remember, but its impact remains undeniable. It was a way of making the ordinary extraordinary, with nothing more than a quick shake of the bottle. Old-fashioned Johnny Marzetti was not just a dish, it was a whole era in one casserole. Ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomato sauce, and shredded cheese came together to make a meal that never failed to deliver. It started in Ohio, where a restaurant gave it a name, but soon it was all over the Midwest, printed in cookbooks and passed between families. It was made in big metal pans, usually on Sundays or when relatives came over. You browned the beef, stirred in the cooked macaroni, added the sauce, canned or homemade, whatever was available, and topped the whole thing with cheese. Then you baked it until the top browned and bubbled. It was a dish that could sit on a counter for an hour and still be good. It fed a crowd, reheated like a dream, and always reminded you of some aunt or grandma who made it best. Johnny Marzetti was cheap, filling, and dependable. It was also quietly brilliant. With 1 pound of meat and a box of pasta, you had dinner for days. Some people added olives or mushrooms, others kept it plain. What mattered was that it showed up, and it always did. Corn chip beef bake was born from the kind of pantry raid that happened in kitchens all across America in the 1970s. Imagine this: you have a pound of ground beef, a half bag of corn chips, a can of tomatoes, and that lonely packet of taco seasoning tucked away in the cupboard. What do? You make dinner magic. This casserole was unapologetically crunchy, cheesy, and bold. You browned the beef with onions and taco seasoning, then layered it with crushed Fritos, cheese, and tomatoes. Some folks threw in a can of kidney beans, others swore by adding sour cream on top right before serving. No matter how you spun it, this dish was like a Tex-Mex lasagna dreamed up during a grocery store strike. It baked into a bubbling, golden masterpiece that was equal parts nacho, taco, and weeknight savior. Parents swore by it for potlucks, and just like that, a new casserole classic was born. But if you think that is inventive, wait until you see how cabbage and beef teamed up to stretch every dollar without missing a beat. Sweetening with birch bark was one of the most ingenious and almost completely forgotten cooking secrets passed down through native traditions. Long before refined sugar ever touched American soil, Native American cooks knew that certain birch trees contained a natural, subtle sweetness hidden within their sap and inner bark. By carefully harvesting thin strips and boiling them down, they created a lightly sweet syrup or infusion that could flavor drinks, breads, and even savory dishes without overwhelming them. It was a sweetness that whispered rather than shouted, blending seamlessly with the smoky, rich flavors of open-fire cooking. Even today, a few remote communities and experimental chefs are bringing birch syrup back to the table, rediscovering a depth of flavor that supermarket sugar can never hope to match. But when it came to cooking full meals without pots or pans, there was one natural vessel that changed everything: giant pumpkins, hollowed out and transformed into Earth's own slow cookers. Cabbage and tomato skillet was what you made when there was nothing left to make. Ground beef, shredded cabbage, canned tomatoes, and onion, fried together until the house smelled like survival. It was not elegant, but it was honest. Every spoonful delivered the bite of pepper and the sweetness of cooked-down cabbage, proof that even a few cheap ingredients could become a family's dinner. This was the food of mill towns, tenant farms, and one-room apartments where every penny mattered. It cooked fast, served plenty, and left almost nothing to clean up. A working mother's blessing. The color alone was cheerful, red and green against the gray of winter. And though no one wrote down the recipe, everyone remembered it. The cabbage and tomato skillet was not about perfection, it was about endurance, the kind that fed both hunger and hope. Beef and sage cornbread bake was the kind of Sunday special that made you race home from church just to get first dibs. Ground beef browned up with onions and a heavy hand of fresh sage was tucked under a thick, buttery layer of cornbread batter, then baked until everything was bubbling and golden. The sage gave the beef this deep, woodsy flavor that wrapped around the sweet cornbread like a warm hug. You would walk into the kitchen, and the smell alone would tell you that it was going to be a good day. Plates were heaped high, smothered with gravy if you had a little extra energy, or eaten straight out of the pan if you just could not wait. This was the kind of dish that felt like a full holiday dinner, even if it was just an ordinary Sunday. You knew you were doing something right when every last crumb got scraped up by someone pretending they were just being polite. And if you thought beef and sage were a heavenly match in the oven, just wait until you see how beef, sunflower seeds, and a cast-iron skillet could team up for a dish so hearty it practically stood up and shook your hand. Trapping natural wild yeasts for bread making was a delicate dance between patience, instinct, and trust in nature. Long before modern yeast packets made baking effortless, native chefs understood how to harness the living cultures floating invisibly all around them. They would leave simple mixtures of ground corn, acorn flour, or other grains mixed with water exposed to the open air, letting wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria settle into the mix over several days. Every loaf was alive, shaped by the air, the season, and the land itself. Each region had its own distinct flavors, a fingerprint left by invisible forces. It was slow, careful baking rooted in the rhythms of the world, not the ticking of a kitchen timer. And if you thought that was incredible, imagine making an entire soup without a pot, without a bowl, just heated rocks, fresh herbs, and the oldest cooking trick you have never heard of. Coca-Cola beef skillet might sound like something dreamed up at a county fair food stand, but back in the 1960s, it was a weeknight marvel. You took a skillet, browned up a pound of ground beef with onions, added a healthy squeeze of ketchup, and then, here's the twist, poured in a splash of Coca-Cola. That was the secret sauce. The soda added a surprising depth, a sticky sweetness that balanced the tang of the ketchup and rounded out the beefy base. It cooked down into something thick and glossy, like a glaze that made every bite feel more indulgent than it had any right to be. Kids went wild for it, and parents loved that it took maybe 15 minutes to get on the table. Coca-Cola beef skillet was the edible proof that the best meals often come from a bit of whimsy and whatever is sitting in the fridge door. And if pasta was your pantry fallback, then the next recipe might just be your new meatloaf obsession. Beef and barley bake was what happened when you wanted stew without the soup. You took ground beef, cooked it with onions, carrots, and sometimes celery, then stirred in pearl barley and baked the whole thing until thick, golden, and aromatic. It was a dish that felt old, like something from your grandmother's farmhouse kitchen. And maybe it was, Barley has been around longer than most grains, and during the 1960s and 1970s, it was one of those ingredients that made a quiet comeback thanks to its price and nutrition. This bake was earthy and dense, like a cross between stuffing and pot roast. You could season it with thyme or just keep it simple. It filled the house with the smell of comfort. It kept you full for hours, and it made even the cheapest cut of beef stretch a little farther. Sometimes you added a splash of tomato juice, sometimes just a pat of butter on top. It was a blank canvas, but a dependable one. You could make it ahead of time, freeze it, and reheat it without losing an ounce of flavor. It may not win beauty contests, but beef and barley bake always won dinner. Rolling beef into cabbage or lettuce leaves was both practical and comforting. Grandma knew that wrapping ground beef in leaves created neat little portions that looked appealing and stretched the meat further. The leaves themselves added bulk, flavor, and nutrition, turning what might have been a small serving of beef into a full meal. Cabbage leaves simmered in tomato sauce gave you stuffed rolls, while lettuce leaves made lighter versions that could be eaten fresh. It was an adaptable trick that suited both hearty winter dinners and lighter summer meals. For families, it provided variety while still relying on the same core ingredient. Kids often loved the novelty of unwrapping the rolls, while adults appreciated how filling they were. This method also meant no one felt shortchanged, even if the beef inside was just a small portion. It was a dish of care and intention, built from the desire to make meals stretch without sacrificing comfort. Today, stuffed leaves feel like a specialty dish, but back then, they were everyday proof of thrift and ingenuity. They carried the taste of home, reminding everyone that resourcefulness could always find a way to feed a family well. Sloppy Joe pie was what happened when someone decided that Sloppy Joes deserved a throne. You started with the classic filling, ground beef, tomato sauce or ketchup, a hint of mustard or Worcestershire if you were feeling adventurous, all simmered until it thickened into that perfect sweet, savory Sloppy Joe consistency. But instead of sandwiching it in a soft bun, you would pour it into a casserole dish and crown it with a golden biscuit crust. Sometimes it was homemade dough, sometimes it was straight from a can, but it always rose into a fluffy, buttery topping that made the whole dish feel complete. Some versions used cornbread instead, which gave it a southern twist with just the right amount of sweetness. And even though it was born in a time when ground beef ruled the dinner table, Sloppy Joe pie had enough personality to still turn heads today. But if you thought ground beef had done it all, just wait until you meet the recipe that turned soda pop into secret sauce. Mexican haystack dinner was more of an event than a recipe. It started with a scoop of ground beef cooked in taco seasoning, then layered like a build-your-own buffet. Over a bed of white rice, or crushed corn chips if you had them, you added beef, shredded lettuce, canned olives, chopped tomatoes, grated cheese, and maybe a spoonful of salsa. The result was a towering, crunchy, colorful plate of dinner that let everyone at the table get exactly what they wanted. This dish became popular in the 1970s when families were busy, budgets were tight, and mealtime needed to be both fast and fun. It was a little Tex-Mex, a little potluck, and a whole lot of pantry smarts. You could make the beef ahead of time and let everyone serve themselves. It was casual, flavorful, and endlessly customizable. Even picky eaters got on board. It became a staple in school lunches, church dinners, and Friday night meals that needed zero cleanup. There was no baking, no timing, and no judgment. Just a pile of food that somehow worked together every single time. Haystacks were creative chaos on a plate, and we loved them for it. Using pumpkin shells as nature's crockpots was one of the most visually stunning and practical techniques Native American cooks ever invented. Imagine carving out a big, sturdy pumpkin, filling it with a mixture of meats, roots, grains, and herbs, and setting it carefully near a low, steady fire. The thick pumpkin walls would slowly roast from the outside while the food inside simmered gently, absorbing all the sweet, nutty flavors of the squash itself. The pumpkin became pot, oven, and seasoning all in one, with no waste and no need for heavy metal tools. When the meal was ready, you simply cut into the tender pumpkin itself and ate it alongside the hearty stew it had helped create. It was a way of turning even the simplest gathering into a feast. And if you thought cooking in pumpkins was impressive, just wait until you see how native cooks used nothing but green leaves and open steam to create fish dishes that tasted like a gift straight from the earth itself. Ground beef and cabbage fritters were a Depression-era innovation that transformed scraps into something golden and crisp. Ground beef was mixed with shredded cabbage, a bit of flour, and eggs, then fried in shallow fat until puffed and browned. They sizzled in the pan, their edges crackling as the aroma filled the kitchen. Eaten hot, they had a tender inside and a satisfying crunch outside. Comfort disguised as thrift. Sometimes served with a dollop of mustard or a spoonful of gravy, they made a modest meal feel special. Housewives loved them for how far they stretched a few ingredients. Children loved them because they felt like a treat. Fritters like these carried the sound of resilience, that hiss of oil and the steady rhythm of turning them over one by one until the whole family could eat. They were made in batches, each one slightly different, depending on what the pantry held. A handful of leftover rice, a pinch of onion, maybe even a spoon of cornmeal to thicken the mix. The fritters symbolized hope and practicality, teaching families that satisfaction could come from resourcefulness rather than riches. When eaten around a warm table, they turned scarcity into a shared kind of joy, proving that even the smallest meal could feed the spirit. Ground beef and wild rice skillet was the kind of meal that tasted like a slow afternoon by a Great Lakes shoreline, where the only thing rushing was the wind through the trees. Ground beef was browned up good and hearty, then tossed with earthy wild rice, caramelized onions, and a pinch of sage or thyme if you were lucky enough to have it growing out back. Wild rice was not the fluffy white stuff either. It had a chew to it, a nutty richness that made even a simple meal feel special. Every forkful was a little bit of beef, a little bit of rice, and a whole lot of satisfaction. Served up with a slab of fry bread or a spoonful of stewed berries on the side, it was the kind of home-style dinner that made you forget about store shelves and remember what real food tasted like. And if you thought wild rice could steal the show, just wait until you get a taste of the Southwest spirit packed into a prickly pear and beef tostada that hits every note from smoky to sweet. Clay-coated meats were one of the most astonishing ways Native American cooks sealed in moisture, flavor, and nutrients without a single modern tool. Fresh game was coated in thick, wet clay, sometimes along with a layer of leaves or bark, then buried directly in hot coals or ash. As the clay baked hard around the meat, it formed a natural oven, trapping the juices inside and allowing the food to steam slowly in its own rich flavors. When the clay was finally cracked open, the aroma would hit you first, deep, smoky, and primal. It was cooking stripped down to its purest, most beautiful form. And even as the meat roasted and absorbed the earth's gifts, native chefs had another breathtaking trick, turning simple berry juice into smoking cloths that kissed their foods with a sweetness no store-bought glaze could ever match. Beef-stuffed zucchini boats were one of the more wholesome trends to come out of the 1970s health food movement, and they still hold up today. This dish was all about balance: protein-packed ground beef, fresh veggies, and just enough cheese to keep things interesting. You started with zucchinis, halved lengthwise, scooped out just enough to make room for the filling, and lightly salted to soften. The filling was where the flavor lived: ground beef browned with garlic, onions, sometimes a touch of tomato or breadcrumbs, and herbs like oregano or parsley. Once that savory mixture was ready, you packed it tightly into the zucchini boats, topped everything with shredded cheese, cheddar or mozzarella usually, and baked until bubbly and golden. And nutritionists gave it a standing ovation. But if you are craving something more indulgent and flakier, then the next dish will take you straight to the savory, golden heart of the American Midwest. Creamed beef in a potato nest was a clever way to make scraps feel like a feast. You would form mashed potatoes into small bowl-shaped mounds, then bake them until the edges crisped and the inside stayed fluffy. Meanwhile, you browned ground beef with onion, made a quick white sauce, and stirred it into a creamy mixture. Then you filled each nest with that savory beef and brought it to the table like it came from a fancy kitchen. It looked upscale, but it was pure practicality. You were using leftover mashed potatoes. You were stretching half a pound of beef with cream, and you were feeding 4 people with something that looked special. It caught on during the 1940s and lasted through the 1960s, mostly in frugal homes and wartime kitchens. Sometimes peas or mushrooms made it into the mix, sometimes shredded cheese on top. No matter the variation, it always felt like a small victory, a little effort, a little flair, and everyone got their own portion. Using ketchup as a glaze was one of those simple touches that gave meatloaf its unmistakable look and flavor. Spread over the top before baking, the ketchup caramelized in the oven, turning into a sticky, sweet coating that balanced the savory beef beneath. It added color that made the dish look more appealing, and kids often loved that familiar, tangy sweetness. For families who grew up on this dish, the glaze became as iconic as the loaf itself. It was an inexpensive trick that elevated plain ground beef into something memorable and comforting. Even today, many people still crave that shiny red topping, not just for the taste, but for the nostalgia it carries. This glaze proved that even a humble pantry item could become the finishing touch that defined a meal. It was never about extravagance, but about turning the ordinary into something people remembered long after dinner was done. Cabbage and beef layer bake was what happened when stuffed cabbage rolls felt like too much effort. Instead of rolling individual leaves, you just chopped the cabbage, browned the beef, and layered everything like a lazy lasagna. Then you poured over tomato sauce and baked it until the whole thing melted into itself. It was tangy, savory, and just the right amount of messy. The breadcrumbs on top gave it crunch, while the cabbage softened underneath like a blanket. This was old country cooking, without the fuss. You could stretch 1 pound of ground beef with half a head of cabbage and still feed 6 people. No special tools, no exotic spices, just tomato, meat, cabbage, and thyme. This bake was especially popular in towns with strong Polish or Russian immigrant roots. It showed up at potlucks, family gatherings, and Tuesday night dinners that needed to be warm and reliable. Sometimes it had rice mixed in, sometimes it had cheese. Either way, it filled the house with a smell that felt like home. You did not need to plate it pretty, just scoop it, serve it, and eat. Simmering beef in canned veggie juice was one of those clever ways to get both flavor and sauce in one step. A can of V8 or plain tomato juice could transform ground beef into a dish that was tangy, savory, and hearty all at once. The juice added moisture, preventing the beef from drying out, while also coating it in a sauce that could be poured over rice, noodles, or bread. This trick was both economical and efficient, using a single ingredient to do the work of several. Families benefited from the added vegetables in the juice, even if they didn't notice, which made it feel healthier too. The flavor was bold, different from plain tomato sauce, and it made dishes stand out from everyday fare. It was resourcefulness wrapped in simplicity, another reminder of how one clever substitution could create something memorable. Today, this hack feels forgotten, but it once carried a sense of ingenuity that families relied on to make meals special. Beef and cottage cheese bake sounds like a weird combination today, but it was considered smart back then. The ground beef was browned and seasoned, then mixed with egg noodles, onions, and generous scoops of cottage cheese. Sometimes there was sour cream, sometimes there was tomato sauce, but it always ended up creamy, savory, and just the right kind of filling. It was especially good for households trying to add protein without buying more meat. Cottage cheese was cheap, and it lasted longer than you expected. This was a casserole that blended dairy and meat in a way that was not fancy but worked. It came out of the oven bubbling, with a top that browned slightly and a center that held together like lasagna without the effort. You could serve it straight from the pan, and it held heat like a dream. Some versions added peas or bell peppers for color, others stayed pure and beige and soft. Either way, it filled the belly and made people happy. In a time when families were cutting coupons and stretching paychecks, this was a dinner you could count on. Simple, practical, and more delicious than it had any right to be. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes was the kind of meal that made you feel like you were sitting in a booth at a roadside diner, even if you were just in your pajamas at the kitchen table. This was pure 1950s and 1960s comfort food, humble, hearty, and wonderfully filling. You started by browning ground beef with onions until it was sizzling and fragrant, then stirred in flour and beef broth to create a thick, savory gravy that clung to every bite. Some folks added a splash of milk or a pat of butter for extra richness. Either way, it worked. This dish was cheap, easy, and practically guaranteed to silence a hungry family. It was also endlessly adaptable: peas, corn, even a fried egg on top if you were feeling bold. This was a meal that made leftovers feel like a blessing. And just when you think ground beef could not get more cozy, the next recipe brings in a ring of flaky biscuits and a dose of party-time charm straight from your grandmother's cookbook shelf. Ground beef and potato hash was the week's final meal. Everything left over fried together until golden and good. Cold potatoes were diced, onions chopped, and ground beef stirred in, sizzling in bacon grease until the edges crisped. The sound alone could make a kitchen feel alive again. It was working people's food, simple and sustaining. The kind of meal that made no apologies for being plain because it did not have to. Served hot from cast iron, it was eaten with ketchup, pickles, or whatever condiment the cupboard still had. In some homes, an egg might crown the top, a small luxury that made it feel like something more. Families called it hash, but it was really a story of thrift, of making beauty from what remained. Every bite carried the smoky taste of labor and care, the warmth of food cooked slow and shared fast. Salt harvesting from natural licks and how it changed food forever is one of those hidden stories that shaped survival more than we realize. In a world without grocery stores or factories, finding salt meant everything. Native American communities knew where the land bled salt, places where groundwater left behind crystals, or wild animals led the way to salt licks hidden deep in forests and valleys. They would collect the precious mineral by hand, scraping or boiling it out of muddy springs, then carefully drying and storing it for trade, cooking, and medicine. Salt preserved meats, flavored stews, and replenished bodies worn down by long journeys or brutal seasons. It was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. But salt was not the only way native chefs elevated their meals. When it came to pure, haunting flavor, they had another secret weapon: the living aroma of the woods themselves turned into smoke and magic. Ground beef and cornmeal dumplings were a true lifesaver when money was tight, but stomachs were growling. The beef was browned up and simmered slow with a few onions and maybe a pinch of pepper. Then it was topped with dollops of cornmeal dough. When it steamed and cooked right over the beefy juices, the dumplings puffed up soft and tender, soaking up every bit of that rich, savory flavor. No one was counting calories back then. They were counting smiles around the dinner table, and these dumplings guaranteed a few extra ones. It was a dish that filled you up from the inside out, the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs in the best way possible. Even better, you could stretch a pound of beef to feed 6 or 7 people easy, which meant there was always enough for unexpected guests or seconds. If you thought that was the peak of stretching flavor and comfort, just wait until you hear about a casserole that captured everything good about ground beef and corn and wrapped it up in pure 1970s nostalgia. Beef and vegetable. Kitchen sink stew was exactly what its name promised: everything but the kitchen sink. It began with ground beef or scraps of leftover roast, followed by whatever vegetables still lingered in the root cellar: carrots, parsnips, turnips, onions, or even cabbage. The pot simmered slowly, the broth growing darker and richer as hours passed. No two batches ever tasted the same because no two kitchens had the same ingredients. It was the definition of resourcefulness, a stew built from odds and ends that might have otherwise gone to waste. Sometimes barley was added to thicken it, or a splash of vinegar to sharpen the flavor. It was a meal of invention, of pride in using every scrap. When families gathered around that steaming pot, they were not just eating, they were honoring the art of survival made delicious. The stew could feed a family for days, each reheating, deepening its flavor. It was never fancy, but it was deeply personal, a record of what the week had been and what was left to carry forward. Every spoonful told a quiet story of thrift, care, and endurance, reminding those who ate it that home was not measured by plenty, but by how you made do with what you had. Roasting root vegetables directly in campfire coals was one of the simplest yet most powerful cooking methods passed down through generations. Without ovens, pots, or fancy tools, native cooks understood that the earth's hidden foods, things like carrots, turnips, onions, and yams, could be transformed into sweet, hearty meals with nothing more than time and fire. Raw roots were buried in the hot, glowing coals of a dying fire, slowly roasting under layers of ash and heat. As they baked, their natural sugars caramelized, their fibers softened, and what once was hard and bitter became soft, rich, and deeply satisfying. Pulling a roasted root from the coals was like uncovering buried treasure, the skin blackened and crisp, the inside steaming and tender. And speaking of patience, some of the sweetest flavors ever created by native chefs required even longer waits, like gathering and boiling maple sap into a clear, nourishing water that tasted like spring itself. Stuffed green pepper skillet was the answer to every busy home cook's prayers. Sure, stuffed peppers looked nice on the plate, but hollowing them out, blanching them, and carefully baking each one? That took time and energy many folks just did not have. This recipe solved the problem by tossing everything into one skillet. You started by browning ground beef with onions and garlic, then added chopped green peppers, not hollowed, not roasted, just chopped and ready to go. Then came the rice, tomato sauce, and seasoning. Some folks spiced it up with paprika or Italian herbs. Others added a splash of beef broth to help everything simmer together. As it cooked, the peppers softened and the rice soaked up all the juices, turning it into a one-pan meal that was rich, hearty, and every bit as flavorful as the classic version. It was the kind of dish that never let a busy night win. But if you liked your skillet meals even saucier and a little more old school, the next dish was like a warm handshake from your grandmother's recipe box. Hamburger gravy on cornbread was a southern staple you rarely see anymore, but it never stopped being smart. You browned ground beef with onions and seasoned it. Salt, pepper, maybe garlic powder if it was handy, then added a bit of flour and milk to make a creamy gravy. Instead of pouring it over biscuits, you served it over a warm slice of cornbread. The result was hearty and slightly sweet, something that stuck to your ribs. In Appalachian regions, this was weekday fare. It used pantry ingredients, filled a plate fast, and tasted like home. Sometimes the cornbread came from a cast-iron skillet, other times from a mix. No one judged. The creaminess, the crumbly texture, the beef salt, and the corn's sweetness made it work. It was cheap, fast, and made you feel cared for. Not fancy, not modern, but still just right. Cooking beef with bread crust lids was another way to make a small amount of meat feel like a full casserole. Grandma would line the top of a dish with old bread crusts, letting them bake until crispy and golden over the beef below. The bread absorbed juices as it baked, creating a savory topping that was both thrifty and delicious. It added texture and bulk, making the dish more satisfying without requiring extra meat. This clever use of stale bread meant nothing went to waste, and every meal looked like a complete dish. Families loved breaking through the crunchy topping to reach the beef underneath, turning dinner into a small event. It was resourcefulness presented in a way that felt indulgent. Today, we rely on breadcrumbs or cheese for toppings, but this old trick carried its own charm. It transformed scraps into something both practical and memorable, the kind of cleverness that defined Grandma's kitchen. Before it made its comeback on social media, beef and tater tot hot dish was already a legend in Midwest kitchens. You browned your ground beef with onion, layered it in a casserole dish, topped it with a can of cream soup, mushroom, celery, chicken, and crowned it with frozen tater tots. Then you baked it until it bubbled. The tots crisped up, the meat stayed saucy, and the whole house smelled like a snow day with nothing else to do but eat. It was cheap, easy, and had everything: protein, carbs, salt, and memory. This dish was never about nutrition. It was about morale. It showed up at church dinners, weeknights, and holiday leftovers. It was a blank canvas, too. Add corn, peas, cheese, whatever needed using. The best versions were a little sloppy, with crisp edges and soft centers. The first scoop might burn your tongue, but no one waited. It was casserole as comfort, and it worked. A meal that made you forget the weather, the bills, and the stress, just for a minute. Old-school goulash, or as some knew it, American chop suey, was the dish that proved ground beef and elbow macaroni were soulmates. This one-pot wonder became a fixture on stovetops from Maine to Missouri. It started with browned beef, onions, and garlic, all bubbling away in a pot. Then came the crushed tomatoes or tomato sauce, which turned the mix into a deep red stew. Toss in a few handfuls of cooked macaroni, and suddenly you had dinner for 6, and maybe lunch tomorrow. What made goulash so special was not just the taste, though that was plenty satisfying. It was the simplicity. It was comfort food with no rules, and that made it a favorite in kitchens where imagination mattered more than a well-stocked pantry. Goulash was the dish that filled plates and hearts at the same time. But if you think that was creative, wait until you see what happened when someone took a bag of corn chips and turned it into dinner. Ash baking was one of the most brilliant and humbling ways Native American cooks created bread without any tools, fancy ovens, or even a proper surface. When you needed to eat, you did not wait for the perfect setup. You dug into the earth itself. Dough was shaped into rough rounds and placed directly onto a bed of hot ashes and embers, then gently covered with more hot ash. The bread would cook slowly, surrounded by a blanket of heat, becoming crusty on the outside and pillowy soft on the inside. If a little ash clung to it, so be it. You brushed it off and bit into a smoky, earthy flavor that modern kitchens would pay fortunes to recreate. It was cooking stripped down to its raw, purest form, food born right from fire and earth. Today, ash-baked bread might seem primitive, but taste one bite of it, and you will understand exactly why this method lasted for centuries. And if you thought bread from ash was wild, wait until you hear how native chefs used cactus to transform even the toughest, most stubborn pieces of meat into buttery, tender feasts. Ground beef and oat loaf was the Depression's answer to meatloaf on a budget. When breadcrumbs were too dear, rolled oats stepped in, binding the meat and stretching it twice as far. Mixed with egg, onion, and a thin smear of tomato, it baked into a dense, hearty loaf that filled the kitchen with warmth. Each slice was firm and chewy, rich with the taste of hard work and determination. Served with mashed potatoes or a spoon of gravy, it gave families a sense of dignity. Real food, real effort, no waste. It was a meal of quiet pride, the kind that reminded people they could make do and still make something good. Even cold the next day, it tasted like comfort, its edges slightly sweet from the caramelized glaze. In every crumb was the story of making a little go a long way, and doing it with grace. Crispy corn cakes. Stuffed with seasoned beef were one of those foods you could smell cooking before you even stepped into the event. Little golden discs sizzling in big iron skillets, stuffed to the brim with ground beef seasoned with paprika, onions, and a pinch of chili powder if you wanted to wake up your taste buds. The outside was crunchy and golden, the inside savory and juicy. It was a dance of textures that made you keep reaching for just one more. The trick was to keep the corn cakes thin enough that they crisped up, but thick enough to hold all that seasoned beef inside without falling apart. At powwows and fairs, you would see kids running around with one in each hand, faces smeared with beefy goodness, while the elders sat back and nodded approvingly. It was simple, it was satisfying, and it was the perfect food for big gatherings where nobody had time for forks and knives. And if you think crispy stuffed corn cakes sound irresistible, wait until you pull up a camp chair and hear about the kind of chili that made starry nights and crackling fires taste even better. Binding with evaporated milk was one of those subtle secrets that most people never realized was happening behind the scenes. Canned milk was a pantry staple, always on hand when fresh milk couldn't be counted on, and Grandma knew exactly how to use it to improve ground beef. Adding just a splash into meatloaf or burger mixtures gave the beef a tenderness it wouldn't have otherwise. It softened the texture, made it more cohesive, and added a richness that made the dish taste like more than the sum of its parts. The slightly concentrated flavor of evaporated milk also enhanced seasonings, blending them through the meat in a way that felt balanced and smooth. For many households, it was an invisible step that made the difference between a dense, heavy loaf and one that cut easily and stayed moist. This was a time when nothing in the pantry went ignored, and canned milk was versatile enough to become a secret weapon in savory as well as sweet cooking. Today, we pass by evaporated milk without thinking, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was part of the quiet magic that made ground beef meals taste better than you remembered. Shipwreck stew looked like a mess, which was the idea. It was all layered into one pot: ground beef, potatoes, rice, canned soup, and maybe a few carrots. No stirring. Just stack it and let it simmer. The name came from how it looked, but the flavor was comforting. It was hearty, tangy, and always filling. This was survival food, emotional or otherwise. No fancy steps. The soup worked as sauce and seasoning. The starches made the beef stretch. It fed a whole family and left some for tomorrow. There was beauty in the chaos. Each family had their version, passed down in notes and memory. Some added beans, others swapped pasta for rice, but all of them made it work. Shipwreck stew meant one thing: making do. And maybe that is why it felt so good. It filled the plate, the belly, and sometimes the quiet. Chow mein hot dish was a Midwestern potluck legend. It walked into the room carrying the scent of soy sauce and sizzling beef and left behind nothing but an empty casserole dish and a few requests for the recipe. Born sometime between post-war optimism and the suburban casserole boom, this dish took inspiration from Chinese-American takeout and made it its own. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions and celery, then mixed with a savory sauce, usually soy sauce and a can of cream of mushroom soup. That combination might sound odd, but it made everything come together with a velvety, umami-heavy punch. But the real fun started when you dumped a whole can of crunchy chow mein noodles right on top before baking. But if that flavor combination sounds bold, buckle up, because the next dish on this forgotten road trip adds soda to the skillet and somehow makes it work. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this: you have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Braised cabbage with beef drippings was simplicity at its purest. In homes where every drop of fat was saved, nothing went to waste, not even the drippings left behind after browning beef. Those drippings were poured into a pan of cabbage and onions, simmered until tender and glistening. The cabbage absorbed every bit of savory richness, turning from plain to deeply flavorful. It was a dish that looked like almost nothing but tasted like something grand. Paired with bread or potatoes, it could stand as a meal on its own. The flavor was smoky, salty, and comforting. Proof that flavor did not come from abundance, but from care. Families who grew up on it still remembered the smell, the sizzle, the sweetness, the quiet satisfaction of making the most out of little. Sometimes the drippings were mixed with a splash of vinegar or a spoonful of sugar to balance the flavors, creating a depth that tasted almost luxurious. This was cooking without waste, a form of love written in grease-stained aprons and well-worn pans. It taught generations that good food did not depend on what you had, but on how you treated it. Campfire ground beef and pine nut ragu was the food of the wild-hearted, cooked under open skies and eaten with smoke still clinging to your clothes. Ground beef was browned over open flames, tossed with rough-chopped root vegetables and a good handful of toasted pine nuts that added little pops of buttery crunch to every bite. There was no measuring, no recipe cards, just instincts, a big old pot, and whatever was growing nearby or tucked away in a leather pouch. Some folks stirred in a splash of bone broth, others just let the juices and sap from the piney air do the heavy lifting. And when it was finally done, thick and savory and just smoky enough to taste the journey, it was ladled out into whatever bowls or tin plates you had on hand, eaten fast because second helpings were not guaranteed. If you think a pine nut ragu can warm your bones, just wait until you sink your teeth into beef glazed with honey and tucked between golden bites of roasted acorn squash. Cabbage and tomato rice soup was humble but radiant, its color alone enough to brighten a dim winter day. A pot of it simmered on many stoves through the 1930s and 1940s, its ingredients simple: cabbage, rice, tomatoes, and maybe a handful of ground beef if fortune allowed. The tomatoes gave it a tang that cut through the sweetness of the cabbage, while the rice thickened it just enough to feel like a meal. This soup had no waste, no excess, only nourishment. It filled homes with the scent of simmering comfort, proof that even the poorest kitchens could make something deeply satisfying. Served with crusts of bread or cornbread, it became more than soup. It became sustenance, flavored with gratitude and hope for better days. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar or sugar to balance the taste, a small touch that gave it life. It was a meal that warmed the body and soothed the soul, a reminder that contentment often came bubbling in the simplest of pots. Infusing oils with wild herbs long before it became trendy was second nature to native cooks who understood that flavor did not come from stores, but from the living world around them. Fresh herbs like sweetgrass, wild mint, sage, and juniper were gathered and carefully steeped in animal fats or pressed plant oils, allowing their potent essences to slowly bloom and transform the base oils into something extraordinary. These infused oils were drizzled over roasted meats, stirred into thick stews, rubbed onto flatbreads, or even used for medicinal purposes. Every bottle or pouch of herb-infused oil was a time capsule of the land's abundance, a way to capture fleeting seasons and extend their gifts into the colder, harder months. Even today, chefs trying to recreate authentic indigenous flavors find themselves returning to these ancient, pure methods. And while infusing oils with herbs might sound refined and elegant, Native American cooking was never about luxury. It was about survival, community, and turning every meal into a ceremony of thanks, a tradition that still whispers through the kitchens of those who have not forgotten. Ground beef fondue balls were the kind of appetizer that made cocktail parties in the 1950s and 1960s feel just a little more exciting. Long before charcuterie boards and sliders took over the scene, these little beef bites ruled the hors d'oeuvre table. The base was simple: seasoned ground beef mixed with cooked rice or shredded cheese, rolled into balls, and sometimes even wrapped around a cube of cheddar. Then came the fun part. You either baked them until crispy or fried them golden brown and served them with a side of bubbling fondue. Cheese, tomato, or mustard-based dips were all fair game. They were easy to make ahead, easy to freeze, and easy to eat, which made them perfect for house parties, church socials, and anything that required a plate of finger food with a little flair. They may have started as a budget-friendly snack, but they were anything but boring. And if your idea of fun is a skillet full of beef, rice, and Tex-Mex spices, then the next recipe is a spicy slice of vintage perfection. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf sounds like something out of a box, and it kind of was. This dinner came from a time when boxed pasta meals and processed cheese were part of every pantry, and ground beef was the weekly star. You would cook macaroni, mix it with browned beef and a block of soft cheese, then pack the whole thing into a greased loaf pan. After baking, you sliced it like meatloaf. What came out looked strange, but tasted like a cross between a diner burger and weeknight casserole. It held its shape well enough to pack in a lunchbox or reheat in a skillet with a little butter. Some families added ketchup or mustard to the mix, giving it an even more literal burger flavor. Others tossed in pickles or onions for texture. It was easy, filling, and did not require much more than a pot, a pan, and a little patience. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf was one of those meals that tasted better than it had any right to. It was not elegant, it was not even normal, but in the era of efficiency and post-war pride, it was exactly what a busy household needed. A whole loaf of dinner made to slice and share. Making stock with beef bones and scraps was a habit rooted in a no-waste philosophy that defined Grandma's cooking. Whenever bones or trimmings were left behind, they weren't discarded. They went into a pot with water, vegetables, and seasonings. Slowly simmered, they produced a rich, flavorful broth that became the base for soups, stews, or gravies. This was how every part of the animal was respected and used to its fullest. The stock added depth to meals, turning simple ingredients into something layered and comforting. Families may not have realized it at the time, but that broth was what gave soups their soul. It was economical too, as it stretched meals further without requiring new ingredients. Today, many people buy boxed stock, but the homemade version was a staple of kitchens that couldn't afford waste. It carried the aroma of patience, filling the house with warmth while it simmered away. The act of making stock wasn't just thrifty, it was symbolic of a time when resourcefulness shaped every meal. It ensured that nothing ever went unappreciated and that even scraps had the chance to bring nourishment and comfort back to the table. Tamale pie with cornmeal crust was the Southwest's answer to a casserole, and it had attitude. The bottom was a savory mix of ground beef, onions, garlic, and chili powder, often with canned tomatoes or beans tossed in for volume. That got spooned into a deep dish. Then came the real star, a thick layer of cheesy cornmeal batter, sometimes spiked with jalapenos or creamed corn, poured over the top and baked until golden. When it came out of the oven, the cornmeal topping had puffed slightly, absorbing just enough of the sauce below to stay moist but never soggy. It smelled like campfire nights and school lunch lines. Tamale pie was bold, spicy, and comforting all at once. It let home cooks experiment with heat and seasoning, especially when taco kits were still new and exciting. You did not need to know how to make tamales to enjoy the flavor. Just beef, cornmeal, and some courage. The recipe showed up in Western and Southwestern cookbooks and made its way across the country in the back pockets of families looking for something different. It was not traditional, but it did not need to be. Tamale pie was its own thing, and that was more than enough. Campfire foil packets were one part meal and one part memory. If you ever went to a summer scout camp or had a backyard cookout in the 1960s or 1970s, chances are you have made one of these. It started with a square of foil and a sense of adventure. You piled on raw ground beef, thin sliced potatoes, carrot coins, and slivers of onion. A little salt, a little pepper, maybe some garlic powder or ketchup if you were living fancy. Then you folded it all up, sealed it tight, and tossed it into the coals, or the oven if you were indoors. What came out 20 or 30 minutes later was something far greater than the sum of its parts. Some families added Worcestershire sauce or a pat of butter before sealing it. Others just kept it simple. But either way, it was delicious. It was also fun. There was something magical about unwrapping your own little packet and digging in with a fork. But if you wanted your beef with a bit more spice and southern flair, the next dish brought jambalaya right into casserole territory. The trick of smoking corn husks for deep, sweet flavor might sound simple today, but it was revolutionary in the world of ancient cooking. Corn was life to many native communities, not just a crop, but a living gift. Every part of it was precious, especially the husks. By soaking them lightly and laying them over hot coals or wrapping food inside them, cooks could infuse whatever they were making with a smoky, sweet richness that no wood or spice could ever truly replace. Smoking corn husks became a way to turn plain dishes into something sacred, layering that faint sweetness into meats, vegetables, even simple bread. It was an invisible ingredient, a secret handshake between the land and the plate. Today, a few high-end restaurants still use this trick, usually without telling you, because the result feels so natural, so impossibly rich, that diners are left wondering what kind of sorcery they have just eaten. But corn was not the only plant they turned to for hidden flavor and power. If you knew where to look, even the tallest pine trees offered a secret recipe for survival. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski style, was comfort born in coal country. It came from immigrant kitchens where butter, onions, and cabbage were fried together until caramelized, then tossed with noodles and bits of ground beef. The result was smoky, soft, and faintly sweet, a dish that felt like warmth itself. It was cheap to make, easy to love, and could feed a crowd for pennies. In Pennsylvania, mining towns and Midwest kitchens, Pulaski became more than a meal. It was memory on a plate. The sizzle of cabbage hitting butter, the smell of onions browning in old cast iron carried a rhythm of tradition. Even without meat, it was satisfying. With it, it became a small feast. Served in big enamel bowls, it spoke of perseverance, of families who worked hard, prayed often, and found joy wherever they could. When it comes to the kind of food that could bring a whole community together, nothing beats a powwow taco skillet. Picture this: golden fry bread sizzling in a cast iron skillet, layered with spiced ground beef, beans, and a sprinkle of sharp cheddar. It is hearty, it is filling, and it is the kind of thing you could smell from half a mile away at a summer fairground. The best part was how everyone had their own little twist. Some would add green chilies, others would pile on diced tomatoes and shredded lettuce. No matter how you stacked it, it was one of those meals where you needed both hands and a whole lot of napkins. It was a festival favorite that always found its way back to the dinner table at home, whether or not there was a real powwow happening. Trust me, once you tried it, no ordinary taco could ever compete. But if you thought the skillet was the ultimate party trick, wait until you see what folks were flipping onto backyard grills during family gatherings. Mixing in stale bread soaked in milk was one of those Depression-era tricks that turned necessity into brilliance. Instead of wasting old bread, Grandma would soften the slices in milk until they were almost mush, then fold them straight into ground beef. This gave the meat extra volume and body, while the milk kept it tender and juicy. It was a way to bulk up meatloaf, burgers, and patties without making them dry or heavy, and no one at the table felt like they were eating less meat. The bread simply disappeared into the mixture, leaving behind a moist, flavorful dish that stretched further than a pound should. This practice also reflected a mindset where nothing went to waste and every scrap was valuable. Today we might see it as a quaint old trick, but back then it was survival and comfort in one. It made meals not only possible but memorable, because they were built out of creativity as much as ingredients. With this method, Grandma could take what might have been thrown away and transform it into something hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, a true testament to the resourcefulness of kitchens from that era. Hungarian hamburger bake brought a little old-world flair to the weeknight dinner table. This casserole took seasoned ground beef and paired it with wide egg noodles, paprika, sour cream, and cheese. You would layer everything into a baking dish, then bake it until the noodles were tender and the sauce was bubbling and golden on top. It was creamy, smoky, and deeply satisfying. The paprika added warmth without being too spicy, and the sour cream gave it that signature tangy richness. It was not exactly authentic Hungarian cuisine, but it borrowed enough to make you feel like you were eating something a little exotic. The recipe was especially popular in Midwestern kitchens, where Eastern European immigrant traditions were still alive and well. It was the kind of dish that made you feel cultured without straying too far from your comfort zone. Most of the ingredients came from cans, boxes, or the fridge, nothing fancy or hard to find, and that was the whole point. Wartime ration hash was not glamorous, it did not pretend to be. But in homes across America during the 1940s, it was dinner, and often a lifesaver. This dish was the ultimate answer to food rationing and meat shortages. You would take whatever you had, maybe a handful of ground beef, a bruised potato, a few limp carrots, and you made it work. Breadcrumbs or oats were added to stretch the beef as far as it could possibly go. Sometimes there were bits of canned green beans or peas tossed in, and if you were lucky, an egg to bind it all together. Everything went into a pan and got crisped until the edges browned and the bottom stuck just a bit to the skillet. Flavor gold, right there. It taught families how to use every last crumb, and it gave a warm, filling meal when the world felt cold and uncertain. But when times got a little better and people had a bit more to spend, things got saucier, cheesier, and a whole lot more comforting. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Ground beef and turnip hash was born in farmhouse kitchens, where turnips were as plentiful as potatoes and just as important. When meat was scarce, women would dice the turnips fine, brown them with onions, and stir in a bit of ground beef for flavor. The turnips softened but kept a slight bite, their peppery taste blending beautifully with the savory meat. Everything cooked together in a skillet until golden and fragrant. It was the taste of thrift, of stretching what the land gave until it lasted through winter. Served hot with a fried egg or a slice of bread, it was a meal that required little but gave plenty. Farmers came in from the fields to eat it, grateful for its warmth and weight. It was not fancy, but it carried the flavor of resilience, the reminder that the simplest foods are often the most honest. Nostalgic beef and sweet corn fry casserole was the dish that looked like a mess but tasted like a memory. Imagine browned ground beef bubbling under a thick layer of golden sweet corn kernels, all tied together with a few shakes of salt and pepper and a little bit of cream if you had it. Baked until the top got crispy and the edges turned caramel brown, it was the kind of casserole that made the whole house smell like comfort. In the 1970s, every family potluck or backyard gathering had at least one version of it, usually scribbled onto a crumpled index card or passed down by word of mouth. Sweet corn was cheap, beef was precious, and when you married the two together, you got a dish that somehow managed to feel luxurious, even when times were lean. The first spoonful always hit you with that sweet, salty magic, and before you knew it, you were scraping the sides of the pan for just one more bite. And if you thought this casserole was the gold standard of hearty, simple eats, just wait until you dive into a beef and hominy masterpiece that practically invented stick-to-your-ribs cooking. Mixing in oats instead of breadcrumbs was one of Grandma's thriftiest and most reliable tricks, and it worked better than most of us realize. Rolled oats blended right into ground beef without taking away from its flavor, and because they absorbed juices, the beef stayed moist instead of drying out. Oats also gave meatloaf and patties a lighter texture that felt more filling, which mattered when you were trying to stretch a single pound to feed an entire table. For families who grew up in leaner times, this clever substitution was about more than thrift. It was about making meals last. Oats were affordable, always in the pantry, and easy to work with, which made them the perfect stand-in when breadcrumbs weren't available. The beauty of this trick is how seamlessly it fit into daily cooking. Most people couldn't even tell oats were hidden inside. Today, it's often overlooked because modern recipes default to breadcrumbs. But in truth, oats gave those classic dishes their old-fashioned heartiness. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about getting the most out of what you had and never letting an ingredient go to waste, which was the very spirit of Grandma's kitchen. Sloppy Joe pie was what you made when a sandwich was not quite enough. The sweet, tangy beef, made with ketchup, mustard, and maybe brown sugar, got spooned into a dish and topped with biscuit dough or pie crust. Then it baked until golden and bubbly. It smelled like school lunches and weekday nights. The filling was classic sloppy Joe, but the crust gave it shape. You could eat it with a fork. You could add cheese. Some families topped it with cornbread or mashed potatoes instead. It was a recipe that adapted to whatever was in the kitchen. What never changed was how satisfying it felt. One pan, one meal, one good reason to sit down and eat. It was often made after a sandwich dinner when the meat outlasted the buns. Sloppy Joe pie made the most of what was left and still gave you something to look forward to. It was humble, but proud, made for people who did not ask for much, just something warm and maybe a little sweet. Rag mop casserole was not just a recipe. It was a reflection of how weirdly wonderful American kitchens could be in the 1950s. Inspired by the popular novelty song of the same name, this dish felt like someone took everything comforting about a weeknight dinner and tossed it in a baking dish on a dare. It all started with ground beef, browned and seasoned in a skillet, then layered with canned spaghetti. You know, the kind drowning in that slightly sweet tomato sauce, and finished off with a cheesy breadcrumb topping that always ended up extra crispy. You could tell this came from a time when convenience and flavor had to shake hands in a hurry. Moms loved it because it used shelf-stable pantry staples. And in a lot of kitchens across small-town America, it was. But if you think that was comfort food turned up to 11, just wait until you hear about the next one. A dish that was practically designed to stretch $1 and fill a table. Beef and cabbage. Hand pies were the perfect working man's lunch. Hearty, portable, and made entirely from leftovers. The dough was simple, a mix of flour, water, and lard rolled thin, then folded over a filling of minced beef, cabbage, and onions. Once baked, they turned golden and crisp on the outside, steaming with savory goodness on the inside. They were sturdy enough to fit in a coat pocket and stay warm through a morning's work in the fields or factory. The smell was rich and homey, the kind that reminded men of the kitchens they had left behind before dawn. For families, these hand pies were a practical miracle, stretching a bit of meat into several meals without waste. Each bite was soft, salty, and comforting, with the faint sweetness of cabbage tying it together. In towns where every penny mattered, these pies offered dignity to the table, a meal that looked humble but tasted like care. They carried with them the quiet pride of homemade food, something crafted by hand in a world that demanded strength and endurance. When unwrapped from a cloth napkin at lunchtime, they represented more than nourishment. They represented home, effort, and the unspoken bond of family waiting at day's end. Reservation-style ground beef and wild onion tacos were the kind of everyday magic that kept folks smiling even when times were tight. Ground beef was stretched thin, seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever wild onions could be foraged nearby. If you have never tasted wild onions, you are missing out. They hit somewhere between a chive and a spring onion, with this bold, peppery snap that made plain beef sing like a church choir. Wrapped up in soft tortillas or sometimes even more fry bread, they were simple, satisfying, and straight from the heart. This was not a meal that needed fancy cheese or salsa piled a mile high. It was pure, straight-talking flavor that left you licking your fingers and hoping there was just one more taco hiding somewhere on the plate. Now, if you think beef and onions are a match made in heaven, wait until you taste how a little bit of sage could turn a beef patty into something unforgettable. Frying leftover meatloaf as sandwich filler was one of Grandma's most clever ways to reinvent yesterday's dinner. She would slice cold meatloaf straight from the fridge, drop it into a hot skillet, and crisp it until the edges sizzled golden while the inside warmed through. Once tucked between bread, sometimes plain, sometimes toasted, it transformed into a hearty sandwich that felt brand new. A swipe of ketchup, mustard, or even leftover gravy turned it into a meal strong enough to rival anything from a diner. This trick meant leftovers never felt repetitive, and kids often had no idea they were eating yesterday's dinner. The crispy edges against soft bread made every bite memorable, the kind of flavor that stuck with you. For lunchboxes, it was a treat disguised as thrift, and many still recall the taste decades later. It was resourcefulness wrapped in comfort, proof that creativity made nothing feel wasted. Today, leftovers often get tossed aside, but back then they were opportunities. Grandma's frying trick showed that with just a little imagination, food could shine twice. Hamburger spoon bread bake was a southern trick that turned two humble meals into one. You seasoned ground beef, poured cornbread batter over it, and baked it until it puffed and browned. The meat stayed juicy, the cornbread caught the drippings, and every bite was soft and satisfying. You served it with a spoon, never sliced. That was the charm. It was food for people who had worked all day and just wanted something warm. It was often made with leftover cornbread or box mix, paired with beef fried with onions and maybe some paprika or chili powder. Cheese? Sometimes. Vegetables? If they were around. It depended on what was in the pantry and who was coming over. Spoon bread bake was loved in small towns where casseroles mattered, and feeding more people with less was a way of life. It might not look like much, but it was as filling as a second helping of love. Shipwreck casserole had a name that made you curious and a flavor that made you stay. No one really knows where the name came from. Some say it is because it used whatever ingredients survived in the pantry. Others say it is just what happened to your kitchen when you made it. But if you were growing up in the 1960s or 1970s, you probably saw this show up on your plate more than once. Ground beef was the anchor, and from there, things got creative. Potatoes, sliced thin or cubed chunky, laid the foundation. Rice, usually the minute kind, came in next. Then canned tomatoes, the workhorse of every budget-friendly meal, tied it all together in a bubbling, slightly tangy mix that somehow always hit the spot. And if you think that is resourceful, wait until you see what happened when people tried to make steak rolls without the steak. Clay pot slow cooking was not just a recipe. It was a way of pulling flavor out of the earth itself. Native American communities would form thick-walled pots from river clay, baking them slowly in open fires until they were strong enough to hold the richest stews and slow-roasted meats you can imagine. The secret was patience. Cooking meat in these pots over smoldering coals allowed the juices to stay trapped inside, cycling through the dish again and again, infusing every bite with pure, concentrated flavor. No fancy Dutch oven, no stainless steel miracle cookware. Just ancient craftsmanship and a bond with nature so strong you could taste it. The slow, even heat of a clay pot gave even the toughest cuts of meat a tenderness you would not believe unless you had tried it. In a world before timers and thermostats, this was real mastery. And the taste? It was as close to magic as food can get. But clay was not the only tool they used to summon incredible flavors. Sometimes, the real secret was hidden in something even lighter than air, something that grew tall all around them: corn husks. Beef and barley stew was built to last. One pot, one slow flame, and enough time to let the world outside freeze while the inside stayed warm. Ground beef browned first, then onions, carrots, barley, and water joined in. Nothing fancy, everything needed. As it simmered for hours, it thickened into a meal you could eat with a spoon or fork. The barley swelled, the cabbage softened, and the beef melted into the broth, turning a few scraps into something that tasted like plenty. It was food that nourished from the inside out, stretching a pound of meat across 3 days if it had to. Every kitchen had its version. More vegetables if the garden was kind, more water if times were lean. It was the taste of patience, of gratitude, and of winter's quiet victories. Adding grated carrots or zucchini into ground beef was a quiet, clever trick that served multiple purposes in Grandma's kitchen. It wasn't only about making the beef stretch further, though that was a big part of it. It was also about slipping in extra nutrition without anyone noticing. Carrots added a natural sweetness that balanced savory flavors, while zucchini added moisture that kept burgers, meatloaf, or casseroles from drying out. Grating the vegetables fine meant they disappeared right into the beef, and kids usually had no idea they were eating vegetables at all. In a time when every ingredient had to be used wisely, this method made sense because it extended protein portions and made meals healthier at the same time. It also gave the beef more body and volume, turning one meal into two without anyone feeling shortchanged. This trick carried a sense of care, because Grandma knew how to make meals nourishing as well as filling. Today, with rising costs and an emphasis on hidden veggies, this old idea feels surprisingly modern. It's a reminder that cleverness in cooking was never about fancy ingredients, but about small adjustments that turned the ordinary into something bigger and better than expected. Mock Swiss steak with ground beef was not fooling anyone, but no one minded. The original called for a real steak pounded flat and simmered in tomato gravy. The ground beef version skipped all that and made a patty. You browned it in a skillet, poured canned tomatoes over it, added onions, and let it simmer. The result was part burger, part meatloaf. It was soft, it was salty, it was cheap and dependable. In homes where steak was not on the menu, this was how you pretended. People served it with mashed potatoes or egg noodles, maybe a slice of white bread for the gravy. A pound of ground beef could stretch far if you shaped it right. This recipe showed up in many cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s. It had different names: mock steak, gravy patties, poor man's steak, but the idea stayed. Make something that felt like more than it was. The kind of dinner that said, "This will do," and really meant it. Beef macaroni loaf was what happened when mid-century homemakers got bored of plain old meatloaf and decided to shake things up, just a little. At first glance, it looked like the usual mix of ground beef, breadcrumbs, and seasoning. But inside, hiding like a delicious surprise, was elbow macaroni, cooked just shy of tender and folded right into the mix. Some versions even swapped out breadcrumbs entirely and used the pasta as the binder. Then came the tomato soup, poured in for moisture, color, and that unmistakable tangy sweet kick that Campbell's fans know all too well. The result was dense, hearty, and oddly elegant, like meatloaf had finally grown up and gotten a little flair. And because macaroni stretched the meat further, it was perfect for feeding bigger families on a budget. But for folks who wanted a more southern touch, the next dish took cornbread to places it had never gone before. The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Cooking with onion soup mix was one of those mid-century hacks that made its way into countless beef recipes, and for good reason. The packets were cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with onion flavor that instantly transformed ground beef. Grandma would sprinkle it into meatloaf, burgers, or casseroles, and suddenly the dish tasted like it had been seasoned all day. The dried onion flakes added texture, while the seasoning mix brought a savory depth that was hard to achieve with just salt and pepper. For busy households, it was a shortcut that never felt like cheating, because the results were always so satisfying. Families grew used to the rich flavor it gave their meals, and the convenience meant it became a pantry staple in many homes. Today, with so many seasoning blends on the shelves, onion soup mix feels almost quaint, but it was once revolutionary in its simplicity. It proved that with a single packet, a plain pound of beef could be turned into something memorable. This trick was less about being fancy and more about being clever, and that's exactly why it became one of Grandma's sworn-by secrets. Savory ground beef Jell-O mold sounds like a joke now, but back then, it was an actual dish you could find in cookbooks across the country. Picture this: ground beef cooked with celery and onions, mixed with tomato or beef-flavored gelatin, and poured into a mold to chill. It came out looking like a jelly-covered meatloaf, and yes, people served it with pride. The gelatin acted as a binder and preservative, letting the dish be prepared ahead of time and stored without refrigeration for longer than usual. It was a wartime or emergency pantry trick that somehow found its way into mainstream cooking in the 1960s. Housewives would slice it into wedges and serve it with saltines or a dollop of mayonnaise, believing it was elegant. It was not, but it was practical. Gelatin was cheap and available, and this dish used only one pan and required no baking. Whether it was a result of rationing, cold buffets, or sheer culinary curiosity, it definitely left an impression. Spiced beef and corn casserole with wild garlic butter was the kind of dish you could smell from the driveway, pulling you straight through the door like a cartoon character chasing a pie on a windowsill. Ground beef was cooked slow with a heavy sprinkle of cumin, paprika, and crushed red pepper, then layered thick with sweet corn kernels and baked into a bubbling golden dream. But the real secret weapon? Wild garlic butter. Made from foraged wild garlic or whatever scrappy greens you could get your hands on, it was melted right over the top before serving, sinking into every crack and corner. The butter softened the spice just enough to keep you going back for bite after bite, and it was not uncommon for folks to scrape the corners of the casserole dish clean with a crust of fry bread. And if you thought a little wild garlic could change the game like that, just wait until you wrap your hands around a stew so smoky and rich it practically dragged the 1980s back into your kitchen. Cabbage and onion gravy over potatoes was a supper made on nights when meat had run out, but hunger had not. Sliced cabbage and onions were fried in beef drippings or butter until soft and browned, then mixed with flour and water to create a rich, savory gravy. It was ladled generously over mashed or boiled potatoes, turning plain vegetables into something deeply satisfying. The dish carried the illusion of meat, smoky, salty, and hearty, even when none was there. It tasted like comfort after a long day, the kind of meal that made everyone quiet around the table. For many families, this gravy was proof that love could fill the space where luxury could not. Sometimes cooks added milk for creaminess or a splash of vinegar for brightness, small touches that gave the gravy depth. Children who grew up on it remembered how it could lift their spirits, even on the leanest nights. It was food that soothed more than it impressed, proof that nourishment was as much about care as it was about ingredients. In every spoonful was the lesson that contentment could be found in the simplest of meals. Making fruit leather with nothing but the sun and a flat rock was the perfect way to capture summer's sweetness for the long, hungry months ahead. Native American cooks would mash wild berries, apples, or plums into thick, pulpy pastes and spread them carefully over flat, sun-warmed stones. Covered lightly with woven grasses or bark to keep pests away, the fruit would dry slowly under the open sky, concentrating into chewy, intensely flavored strips packed with vitamins and natural sugars. These homemade fruit leathers were not just snacks. They were essential travel rations, dessert after lean meals, and precious gifts given between families and tribes. And while these sweet creations came from the land's generosity, another treasure was pulled from its hidden places too, one that changed cooking, trade, and survival forever: the gathering of salt from natural licks deep in the wild. Midwest meat. Pie was not a shepherd's pie. It was not a pot pie either. This dish stood proudly on its own, wrapped in flaky pastry and packed with flavor that hit like a warm embrace. Ground beef was the star, sautéed with onions, garlic, and sometimes carrots or peas, then thickened with beef broth or gravy until it reached that perfect spoon-coating consistency. All of that got tucked into a homemade, or store-bought, we won't tell, pie crust and sealed shut like a delicious little secret. Once baked, the crust turned golden and buttery, and the filling stayed rich, savory, and steaming hot. It was a meal that stuck with you, perfect for cold nights, family gatherings, or just when you wanted to feel like you were eating something special. But for a truly nostalgic flavor bomb that needed only a skillet and a squirt bottle, The next recipe made weeknights a lot more exciting and a little sweeter too. Beef and tomato aspic with vegetables was once considered elegant. Seriously. You started with unflavored gelatin, added beef broth or tomato juice, and poured it over cooked beef, celery, peas, and carrots. Then it chilled in the fridge until firm. Served cold and shaped in a decorative mold, this jiggly dish became the centerpiece of many retro dinner parties. It was savory jello, made not for sweetness, but for structure. The gelatin gave it shine, the beef gave it weight, the vegetables gave it texture, and the result was something you either liked or quietly skipped. Aspic ruled mid-century American cookbooks, especially for hosts wanting to impress. It was low-fat, high-protein, and oddly artistic. You would slice it thin and serve it with lemon or a dab of mayo. Today, it feels outdated. But for a generation raised on molded salads and chilled entrees, beef and tomato aspic was proof that even simple ingredients could be dressed up to impress. Serving beef over toast or biscuits was one of the thriftiest ways Grandma stretched a small skillet of meat. Instead of adding more beef, she would take the cooked mixture, make a simple gravy, and spoon it generously over slices of bread or warm biscuits. This created the illusion of a bigger meal, since the bread soaked up the juices and made each bite hearty. It was the kind of dish that filled plates quickly and satisfied hungry mouths without needing much meat at all. For working families, this trick turned a half-pound of beef into enough for dinner, and the smell of warm bread and gravy was enough to make it feel like a treat. It was economical, practical, and comforting all at once. Many children grew up associating this dish with rainy days and cozy evenings, not realizing it was born from thrift. It was another example of turning less into more with a bit of kitchen know-how. Hamburger eggplant casserole was a post-war invention that came straight out of backyard gardens and budget-conscious kitchens. People grew eggplant because it was hearty, easy to harvest, and filled out a meal when meat was in short supply. The dish started with sliced, salted eggplant that was briefly fried or baked, then layered with cooked ground beef, tomato sauce, and breadcrumbs. Sometimes there was cheese, sometimes not. It all depended on what you had. The flavors were simple but filling: rich tomato, soft eggplant, and the unmistakable heartiness of seasoned ground beef. You baked it until it bubbled and browned on top, and by the time it hit the table, it looked like a home-cooked lasagna without any of the fuss. This was food you made when you had too many eggplants and not enough time. It was healthy by accident and thrifty by design. You could serve it as a main course or stretch it with a side of white rice. Either way, it felt like a proper meal. Hamburger eggplant casserole may not have survived the decades in style, but it never failed where it counted: in taste, texture, and the comfort of something hot at the end of the day. Beef and cornbread. Tamale pie was a hug from the Southwest, baked golden brown in a casserole dish. This one dated all the way back to the 1940s, when resourcefulness met regional flavor. Ground beef was the heart of it, cooked down with onions, garlic, and sometimes diced green chilies or sweet corn. Tomato paste or enchilada sauce brought the whole mixture together into something tangy, rich, and unmistakably bold. But the real showstopper was the topping: a thick layer of cornbread batter poured over the beef and baked until it puffed up like a golden crown. It was budget-friendly, filling, and packed enough punch to wake up even the sleepiest of taste buds. Families across the American Southwest and far beyond served it up with a dollop of sour cream and maybe a little salsa on the side. But if you are someone who loves the flavor of stuffed peppers but hates all the prep, the next dish was a skillet solution that changed the game. Depression-era cabbage soup was survival in a pot. It began with water, not stock, and whatever scraps the week had left behind: a ham bone, a heel of onion, a wilted carrot. Cabbage went in by the handful, sliced thin to cook down soft, its sweetness turning broth into something more than it was. Ground beef or sausage might stretch across several meals, browned just enough to flavor the pot before being set aside for tomorrow. People called it soup, but it was more like resilience simmered on the stove. It filled the belly, warmed cold hands, and kept families fed through long winters when the pantry shelves were bare. The taste was humble, peppery, cabbage sweet, sometimes smoky if luck allowed, and yet no one complained. In those days, waste was unthinkable, and gratitude was constant. That pot of cabbage soup was not just dinner, it was hope you could eat. Sage-infused ground beef patties might sound like something you would find in a fancy restaurant today, but back then, it was just another stroke of pure homegrown genius. Sage was everywhere in the right parts of the country, and it did not cost a dime to pick some fresh sprigs. Mixed into ground beef with a little salt and a whole lot of care, the result was a smoky, savory patty that smelled so good cooking, you would swear it could make a grown man cry. Fried up in an old cast-iron pan until the edges were crispy and the middle stayed juicy, these patties were tossed onto plates with a scoop of beans, maybe some fried potatoes if you were lucky. They were not just filling, they were soul-satisfying. And once you tasted beef lifted up by wild sage, you would wonder why anyone ever bothered with plain salt and pepper again. Speaking of dishes that hit you right in the comfort zone, the next one was a staple at tables that needed stretching a meal just a little bit farther. Stretching with mashed potatoes was another clever way Grandma turned a little beef into a lot of dinner. Whenever there were leftovers sitting in the fridge, she didn't let them go unused. Instead, she folded the mashed potatoes directly into ground beef. The result was a creamy, hearty mixture that could be shaped into patties, baked into casseroles, or fried into crisp cakes that still tasted rich and filling. Potatoes not only extended the beef, but also added a silky texture that breadcrumbs or flour couldn't match. It was comfort food through and through, with a flavor that spoke to both frugality and warmth. Families who grew up on potato-stretched beef never forgot the way it felt to eat something so satisfying, even when times were lean. This wasn't a compromise. It was a form of creativity that made each bite taste more substantial. Instead of thinking about what was missing, you thought about how clever the dish was, how it filled the belly, and how Grandma always seemed to know how to make just enough food for everyone. These days, we often discard leftovers or reach for more meat, but the potato trick proves a pound could go further than you thought. Salisbury steak casserole was the homemade version of a frozen food legend. Instead of pulling a silver tray from the oven, families made their own from scratch, and honestly, it was usually better. This version called for seasoned ground beef shaped into thick oval patties, then baked in a mushroom and onion gravy. It was rich, saucy, and had that stick-to-your-ribs kind of feel. If you were lucky, someone would sprinkle crispy fried onions on top during the last few minutes in the oven, adding that perfect crunch to an already comforting dish. It was not a fancy meal, but it felt like something special. Some people added Worcestershire sauce or a splash of soy for extra umami, but most just used canned soup and a good hand with salt and pepper. You would serve it with mashed potatoes, egg noodles, or a slice of white bread to sop up all that gravy. Kids loved it because it tasted like fast food. Adults loved it because it was hearty and cheap. Beef birds, sometimes called mock steak rolls, were the kind of food that made you feel like you were having a fancy dinner, even if the meat came from the budget bin. The idea was simple but genius. Take seasoned ground beef, flatten it out like you are making an edible canvas, roll it up with stuffing or sometimes chopped onions inside, then tie or skewer it like it is some French roast on Sunday dinner. These little bundles were browned in a pan and sometimes finished in gravy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been waiting all day for it. The texture was soft, the taste was rich, and the presentation, well, that part made you feel like you were dining at a place that had real cloth napkins. They were a perfect disguise for humble ingredients. And just when you think the American kitchen could not get more inventive, along came a dish that turned ground beef into a noodle-topped flavor bomb with a crunchy surprise. Making a gravy base from beef drippings was one of the most practical and delicious habits Grandma swore by. After frying ground beef, she never just poured off the pan juices, they were too valuable to waste. Instead, she whisked in flour, maybe a splash of broth or milk, and built a flavorful gravy that could be ladled over mashed potatoes, bread, or noodles. This simple act turned a basic skillet of beef into a complete, comforting meal that stretched to feed more mouths. It gave dinners depth and warmth, making even small portions feel satisfying. Families relied on this trick not only because it saved money, but because it created flavor from what others might have discarded. The aroma of that sizzling gravy filled kitchens and promised a meal that was both hearty and resourceful. These days, we're often told to drain and discard fat for health reasons, but back then, every drop was an opportunity. That was the beauty of Grandma's cooking, knowing how to turn scraps into something rich, flavorful, and worth remembering long after the plates were cleared. Mock Swiss steak was a stovetop classic that delivered comfort without complication. Now, it had nothing to do with Switzerland, and it was not really steak either, but none of that mattered once the fork hit the plate. This dish was pure 1950s ingenuity, turning ground beef into a dinner that felt fancier than it had any right to be. The beef was shaped into thick oval patties, then dredged lightly in flour and browned until the edges crisped. But the real magic happened when the tomato and onion gravy hit the pan. Sweet, savory, and slow-simmered, that sauce softened the patties until they practically melted. Some folks added a bit of garlic, a pinch of oregano, or even a splash of vinegar to give it extra depth. Served over mashed potatoes or wide egg noodles, it was the kind of meal that made you sigh after the first bite. And just when you thought ground beef had done everything it could for dinner, it decided to show up at the breakfast table and brought the eggs and cheese along for the ride. Smoky ground beef with wild mint and juniper berries might sound like something a fancy chef dreamed up, but long before it ever hit a white tablecloth, it was the food of survival and celebration. Ground beef was browned low and slow, then mixed with hand-picked wild mint leaves and crushed juniper berries, which gave it this cool, smoky bite that you could not fake with store-bought seasoning. The beef soaked up the woodsy flavors until every bite was like eating a piece of the forest itself. It was a dish that stuck with you, the kind of taste that did not just fill your belly, but rooted itself deep into your memory. Sometimes it was served with a simple flatbread, sometimes spooned over roasted squash or wild rice if you were lucky. If you think mint and juniper could breathe that much new life into a skillet of beef, wait until you see how good old-fashioned flint corn turned a humble shepherd's pie into a feast you would swear was touched by magic. Ground beef. Hot dish was the heart of the Midwest in a single baking pan. Ground beef browned with onions, noodles, cabbage, and canned soup came together in layers of creamy, cozy satisfaction. It was not fancy. It was practical, filling, and made with love. The cream of mushroom was the secret ingredient that turned scraps into something indulgent. Housewives baked it until bubbling, the top golden, the aroma filling every corner of the house. It was a dish that brought families together without fanfare, eaten from mismatched plates at kitchen tables worn smooth by years of use. The hot dish represented a generation's creativity, proof that with a few cans, some leftovers, and a bit of heart, anyone could feed a family well. It was the kind of meal that left no one hungry and no one forgotten. Some topped it with breadcrumbs or tater tots, giving it a little crunch to contrast the creamy middle. Others swapped ingredients as needed, corn for noodles, cabbage for peas, but the result was always the same, something comforting, familiar, and warm. Ground beef hot dish was more than food. It was connection, community, and the taste of shared survival wrapped in steam and love. Using rice as a filler was one of the oldest and most dependable tricks for making ground beef go further. Grandma could take a single pound of beef and, with the addition of rice, stretch it into a whole pot of hearty food that filled every plate. Sometimes she used cooked rice, folding it in to bulk up casseroles and stews, while other times she used raw rice, letting it absorb juices as it cooked right alongside the beef. This was how porcupine meatballs became a household favorite, fluffy grains poking out from tender beef in a tomato-based sauce. It wasn't just about thrift, though. Rice added body, absorbed flavors beautifully, and made each bite feel substantial. In times when budgets were tight, this clever trick allowed families to keep eating beef dishes without breaking the bank. It was practical, resourceful, and tasted so good that no one felt they were missing out. Even now, the combination of beef and rice has a homey, comforting feel to it, reminding us of tables where nothing was wasted and meals always seemed to stretch just far enough to feed everyone gathered. Texas hash was not born in a diner or dreamed up by a chef. It came from necessity, flavor, and the magic of one-pan cooking. This dish was a lifesaver in kitchens during the 1960s and 1970s, especially when money was tight but taste still mattered. It started in a skillet, like most good things do. Ground beef hit the pan, followed by chopped onions and bell peppers. As everything sizzled and softened, in went the tomatoes, sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, and a scoop of cooked rice. Chili powder or a few dashes of hot sauce gave it a warm Tex-Mex flair without pushing into full-on heat. It was hearty, filling, and endlessly flexible. Some families added corn or black beans. No wonder it stayed in rotation for decades. But if Texas hash was the rebellious teen of ground beef meals, the next dish was pure whimsy, because what could possibly go wrong with meat and mashed potatoes shaped like a bird's nest? How native chefs made instant trail mix with dried berries and nuts is a perfect example of simple genius meeting real-world survival. Long before colorful packages lined grocery store shelves, Native American communities were gathering handfuls of nature's purest energy foods, drying them carefully under the sun, and combining them into powerful, portable meals. Wild berries like chokecherry, elderberry, and wild strawberries were prized for their tartness and nutrition, while nuts like acorns, walnuts, and pine nuts packed a heavy punch of fat and protein. Some tribes even added roasted seeds, puffed grains, or strips of dried meat for extra stamina. The goal was not just taste, but endurance. It was survival in your pocket, designed by thousands of years of knowledge. And while they packed sweetness and strength into every bite, when it came to seasoning savory meals, native chefs turned to another source altogether: wild plants that turned every piece of meat into pure wilderness flavor. Cabbage and milk stew was the quiet staple of dairy country, born from necessity and ingenuity. In regions where milk was easier to come by than stock, women used it to build a creamy base for cabbage and bits of ground beef. The milk thickened as it simmered, wrapping the vegetables in a gentle, velvety sauce. The result was mild, nourishing, and surprisingly rich, comfort made from simplicity. Some added a pinch of nutmeg or pepper to balance the sweetness. Others stirred in leftover potatoes to make it thicker. It was not glamorous food, but it was deeply human. The kind of meal you ate slowly with gratitude. The aroma of warm milk and cabbage filled the kitchen with quiet calm. In every spoonful was the story of families who made do, who turned scarcity into something beautiful through patience and heart. Even after mealtime ended, the smell lingered, clinging to aprons and windowsills, reminding everyone that love could be measured in simmering pots. It was a meal that restored more than hunger. It restored peace. Crispy fried beef and root vegetable pockets were not just dinner. They were survival disguised as a treat. Picture dough rolled thin, packed full of seasoned ground beef, diced carrots, sweet potatoes, and turnips, then folded tight and fried until golden and flaky. It was like the first generation of the hand pies everyone brags about today, only made from scratch, with love and whatever you had left in the root cellar. These little pockets were the ultimate grab-and-go meal before drive-thrus were even a thing. They stayed warm wrapped in cloth, perfect for long days in the fields or a chilly walk to the town market. Every bite was crispy outside, juicy and tender inside, with the sweet earthiness of the root veggies soaking up all the beefy flavor. Families would make dozens at a time and stash them away for later, if they managed to last that long. Now, if you think stuffing beef and veggies into a crispy golden package sounds brilliant, wait until you hear about the Sunday classic that brought sage, beef, and cornbread together into something that tasted a whole lot like home. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely. And tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With 1 can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic, but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Beef and apple casserole sounds strange until you try it. It mixed brown beef with tart apples and onions, then baked it all in a mild broth or tomato sauce. The apples softened, turned sweet, and played off the savory beef in a way that felt surprising and familiar. It was not a dessert, not quite a stew. Somewhere in between, like pork chops and applesauce, but humbler. Some versions had breadcrumbs or mashed potatoes on top. Others stayed plain, served with toast. It was one of those oddball casserole ideas that only made sense in the 1960s. And many people made it again. The apples deepened the beef, the onions tied it all together. Sweet, savory, soft, and strange, but it worked. And for the people who made it back then, the taste never really left. The secret of grease preserves is one of those survival tricks that almost defies belief today. After cooking meat, Native American chefs would save every drop of rendered animal fat, pouring it carefully over shredded or chopped pieces of the meat inside clay pots or animal bladders. Once sealed, the fat hardened into a protective barrier that kept bacteria and air out, preserving the meat for weeks, even months. This was not just storage. It was insurance against famine, sickness, and scarcity. Meat preserved this way stayed rich, flavorful, and nutritious, providing vital energy when fresh food was impossible to find. Every time someone dipped into a pot of grease preserves, they were eating a lesson in patience, gratitude, and survival. But even the best preserved meat needed help lasting through long journeys or seasons, and sometimes the land itself offered the perfect cold pantry, hidden just beneath your feet. Egg and beef bake, also known by some as breakfast surprise, was the kind of dish that turned a simple Sunday morning into something worth writing home about. Popular at church brunches and potluck tables throughout the 1960s and 1970s, this casserole was a hidden gem in the world of ground beef cooking. It started with scrambled eggs, sometimes real, sometimes powdered, depending on the budget, mixed with seasoned ground beef, sautéed onions, and a generous helping of cheese. Some versions included potatoes, others stirred in day-old bread cubes to stretch the meal and soak up all the flavor. It was perfect for early risers, late sleepers, or anyone who believed breakfast should be more than just toast and coffee. And if that sounds like a surprising way to wake up, just wait until you see what happened when health food met comfort food in the 1970s garden patch. Hearty ground beef and Flint corn shepherd's pie was not just a dish, it was a statement. Ground beef seasoned with onions, garlic, and wild herbs formed the base, but the real star was the topping, a mash made from Flint cornmeal instead of regular old potatoes. Flint corn, the rugged ancestor of sweet corn, had this deep, nutty flavor that took the whole pie to another level. It was a tough crop that thrived when nothing else would, which made it the perfect partner for a meal built to last. The top baked into a golden crust, just thick enough to crack when you spooned into it, revealing the juicy beef and rich gravy underneath. It was a shepherd's pie made for real shepherds. Sturdy, filling, and full of heart. And if you thought that was the peak of comfort food innovation, just wait until you hear about the fritters that brought sweet potatoes and beef together in a state fair dream you could actually carry in your hand. Ground beef and heirloom. Bean chili was not just a dinner, it was a memory in a bowl. Picture a heavy pot hanging over a campfire filled with ground beef simmering alongside a rainbow of heirloom beans. Pinto beans, black beans, cranberry beans, all the ones your grandmother insisted were better than anything from a can. The beef gave it depth, the beans gave it body, and a handful of crushed wild herbs gave it a smoky aroma that floated through the night air. It was not the tongue-searing chili you find at competitions today either. This was smooth, mellow, and rich, made to be eaten with big hunks of bread or scooped right out of the pot with a wooden spoon. After a long day of work or a night under the stars, nothing tasted better. If you were lucky, There was always a second pot heating up for breakfast too, because good chili was not something you left behind. Now, if you thought a pot of campfire chili could make a night unforgettable, just wait until you see how a little cedar smoke could turn plain beef into backyard magic. Cabbage and rice bake was an act of comfort disguised as frugality. Leftover rice met cabbage and beef in a casserole dish, topped with breadcrumbs or a drizzle of milk to keep it moist. It baked until tender, the top golden, the smell rich and homey. This dish was how families turned scarcity into satisfaction. It filled bellies without emptying wallets, and its leftovers reheated even better the next day. Many cooks flavored it with paprika, garlic, or tomato, each one adding their own touch of love. The rice made it stretch further, the cabbage made it wholesome, the beef made it feel complete. Served in deep scoops with bread and butter, it was more than a meal. It was reassurance that even hard times could taste good. In quiet kitchens across America, cabbage and rice bake became the taste of perseverance made edible. Acorn meal might not sound glamorous today, but to Native American cooks, it was a golden ticket to rich, sustaining nutrition. In a world where wheat and cornmeal were not always reliable, acorns from oak trees were gathered in huge numbers, then carefully leached to remove bitterness. The result was a fine, nutty flour that could be used to make breads, thick soups, or even hearty porridges. Acorn meal carried a deep, earthy taste that felt heavier and more nourishing than modern flour, and it was packed with oils and minerals that kept bodies strong through brutal winters and hard seasons. It was slow, careful work, but it paid off with food that could last for months. And unlike store-bought flour today, acorn meal reminded every bite of where it came from. But even when bread was needed quickly, native chefs had a trick up their sleeves, heating river stones until they became the perfect natural griddles for making flatbreads on the fly. Mixing in peanut butter for savory stew was one of those surprising wartime tricks that made sense once you tried it. Peanut butter was affordable, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, so it became a clever addition when meat was scarce. Stirred into a beef stew, it thickened the broth and gave it a nutty richness that made the dish feel heartier. It wasn't about making the stew taste like peanuts, but about adding depth and body to the flavor. Families often didn't even know the secret ingredient, only that the meal tasted comforting and filling. This hack proved that resourcefulness could be creative, turning an ordinary stew into something unique. It also showed how flexible ingredients could be when money and rations were tight. Today, the idea might sound unusual, but for Grandma, it was a quiet way to make sure her family got the nourishment they needed without feeling like they were missing out. Beef jambalaya bake took everything you loved about Louisiana comfort food and gave it a weeknight twist. Traditional jambalaya was made with shrimp or sausage, but when ground beef was what you had, you did not complain, you improvised. This casserole was warm, spicy, and overflowing with flavor. You would start by browning the beef in a skillet with onions, bell peppers, and celery, the Cajun holy trinity. Toss in some garlic, tomato paste, and a good shake of paprika or cayenne pepper, and suddenly, the whole house smelled like dinner was about to get exciting. Then came the rice, which cooked in the pan with beef broth or tomato juice until everything swelled and soaked up the seasoning. Some families added beans or corn. Others threw cheese on top and baked it for an extra kick. It was the kind of dish that got passed around the table fast and left nothing behind but crumbs. And if you think baking jambalaya was clever, just wait until you see what happens when you stuff a hamburger inside an onion. No bun required. Cabbage and dumpling pot was a meal that filled both stomachs and hearts when little else could. It started with a pot of broth, sometimes made from beef bones, sometimes just salted water, and a heap of sliced cabbage simmering slowly until tender. Then came the dumplings, spoonfuls of soft flour dough dropped directly into the bubbling pot. They puffed up as they cooked, absorbing the savory flavor of the broth and the sweetness of the cabbage. The result was a meal thick and comforting enough to feed a family through the coldest night. It smelled like home and patience, like something that had taken time even when there was not much to spare. No one went hungry around that pot, and even the simplest ingredients tasted rich when shared with love. It was the kind of food that made silence at the table feel like gratitude. Turning beef into breakfast hash was a clever way of making leftovers feel like a brand new meal. Instead of letting scraps of ground beef go unused, Grandma would crumble them into a skillet with diced potatoes and onions. Fried until golden and crispy, the mixture became a hearty breakfast that kept families full until lunch. This trick was about more than thrift. It was about variety, ensuring that yesterday's dinner didn't feel repetitive. Sometimes eggs were cracked on top or served alongside, making the dish even more satisfying. The sizzling smell of hash in the morning was the kind of aroma that filled kitchens with warmth and comfort. It showed that no ingredient was too small to be reinvented into something substantial. Today, we think of hash as diner food, but it was once a symbol of resourcefulness at home. It turned the act of using leftovers into an opportunity for something delicious and comforting. Ground beef and wild mustard greens. Stir-fry was the kind of meal that showed up fast and disappeared even faster. This was not some high-end stir-fry piled with expensive sauces either. It was a down-home skillet sizzler made with ground beef cooked hot and fast, tossed with handfuls of peppery wild mustard greens, plucked fresh from wherever you could find them. Those greens had bite, real bite, and they gave the beef this sharp, earthy pop that plain old spinach could only dream of. A splash of vinegar, a sprinkle of salt, and maybe a little bacon grease if you had it lying around, and you had a dish that punched way above its weight. It was light enough for summer, hearty enough for winter, and cheap enough to keep families fed when money was just a rumor. Stir-fries like these were the ultimate in practical magic, a fast meal that felt like you had been planning it all day. And if you thought a pile of spicy greens and sizzling beef was as good as it gets, just wait until you bite into a crispy pocket filled with beef and roasted roots, the kind of thing Great-Grandma used to make when the nights got cold. The lost trick of dry stone soup is one of the most breathtaking examples of cooking ingenuity hidden in history. In times when pots were scarce or broken, native chefs would still find ways to create nourishing, flavorful stews using nothing but fire-heated rocks and hand-picked herbs. Clean, flat stones were heated in a roaring fire until they almost glowed, then carefully transferred into woven bark baskets or hide-lined pits filled with water and raw ingredients. As the stones boiled the water, fresh roots, wild greens, dried meats, and foraged herbs were added, cooking into rich, smoky broths that filled the air with the scent of earth and flame. The rocks would be swapped out as they cooled, replaced again and again with fresh hot ones, keeping the liquid at a steady simmer. And when it came to sweet treats for the journey ahead, native chefs had one more marvel: crafting rich, chewy fruit leather with nothing but sunlight, fresh air, and the simplest tools imaginable. Hot dog and ground beef skillet was not just a kid-friendly meal. It was dinner in a pinch. You sliced a few hot dogs, browned them with ground beef and chopped onions, then stirred in a can of tomatoes. Maybe some macaroni if you were feeling ambitious. Let it simmer until the sauce thickened. Kids loved the hot dogs. Adults liked that it filled everyone up. Some called it cowboy skillet. Others called it Tuesday. Either way, it stretched two meats into a full meal. No need for sides. Just a fork, a plate, and a few quiet minutes where everyone actually ate. These kinds of dishes showed up in older cookbooks, especially the kind you got free with a cereal box. They were not about impressing anyone, just making do. Folding in cooked barley was another clever trick that turned ground beef into something heartier without costing more. Barley was cheap, filling, and had a nutty flavor that paired perfectly with beef. Once cooked and added to the meat, it absorbed juices and spices, stretching the mixture into larger portions. Families didn't just get more food, they got a meal that felt satisfying and rustic, with a chewy texture that stood out from plain beef alone. This was especially common during hard times when making meat last was a necessity. The grain gave the illusion of abundance and made sure no one left the table hungry. Barley also brought a wholesome quality, adding nutrition while keeping costs low. Today, barley has mostly been forgotten in beef dishes, but its role in old kitchens was vital. It showed that the best fillers weren't bland. They actually added flavor and substance that made meals taste richer. Spicing meat with wild juniper and sage instead of store-bought seasonings was a mark of true culinary craftsmanship long before organic became a buzzword. Juniper berries with their sharp piney taste and sage leaves with their deep, smoky aroma were easy to find across wide swaths of native lands, and together they created one of the oldest and most unforgettable flavor combinations known to man. Hunters would rub juniper directly onto fresh meat before roasting it over fires, allowing the resins to seep into the flesh and protect it from bacteria while infusing it with mouth-watering flavor. Sage was burned, brewed, and crushed into spice blends that transformed even the toughest game meats into savory, aromatic feasts. And just when you think seasoning meat could not get any more poetic, native chefs took it one step further, discovering a way to use wild berries not just as food, but as a way to glaze and preserve fish in the most mouth-watering way imaginable. Ground beef and cabbage gravy over bread was the meal you made when there was almost nothing left, and somehow it still tasted like kindness. Ground beef browned with onions and cabbage made a quick, rich gravy thickened with flour and broth. It was spooned over day-old bread or toast, soaking in until it became soft and savory. The first bite warmed the chest. The second reminded you that a meal could still feel generous even when it was not. Families called it poor man's stew, but there was dignity in its making. The cabbage stretched the meat, the bread caught every drop of flavor, and together they became something greater than the sum of their parts. It was not about indulgence. It was about care and making sure everyone got their share. Ground beef and roasted pumpkin stew was proof that simple ingredients could make meals fit for kings, or at least tired farmers at the end of a long day. Chunks of roasted pumpkin, sweet and caramelized around the edges, were simmered slow with seasoned ground beef, a splash of broth, and whatever herbs were growing out back. The pumpkin melted just enough to thicken the stew without turning it to mush, giving every bite a natural sweetness that played perfectly against the savory beef. Ladled into big bowls and eaten with hunks of bread or thick corn cakes, it was a harvest meal through and through. The best part was how it changed depending on what you had. Sometimes wild herbs, sometimes a handful of dried berries thrown in for a tangy surprise. It was all about using what the earth gave you and making something unforgettable with it. And if you think beef and pumpkin make a strong team, just wait until you taste smoky ground beef laced with the wild kiss of mint and juniper berries. Shaping beef into steaks was one of those clever illusions that made dinners feel fancier than they really were. With a bit of seasoning and careful shaping, Grandma could take plain ground beef and press it into oval patties that looked like individual cuts of steak. Once browned in a skillet and topped with gravy or onions, they gave the impression of a hearty, steakhouse-style meal without the cost of real steak. For families who couldn't often afford higher cuts of meat, this trick was a way to enjoy the feeling of indulgence without breaking the budget. Kids grew up thinking they were eating something special, and in a way, they were. The special part was how much love and creativity went into making dinner stretch. The technique wasn't complicated, but it carried a sense of pride in serving meals that looked more extravagant than they were. Today we call it Salisbury steak or hamburger steak, but the heart of it is the same, turning ground beef into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was resourcefulness wrapped in flavor, and it left memories stronger than the meat itself. Ketchup-glazed meat patties were weekday magic. No frills, no fuss, just ground beef, shaped into thick little patties, pan-fried to a crusty edge, and glazed with that one bottle every American kitchen had on standby. The glaze was simple: ketchup, maybe a little brown sugar or mustard if you were feeling creative, sometimes even a splash of vinegar or soy sauce for balance. Once the patties were nearly cooked through, that sticky sauce went right on top and bubbled into a sweet, savory layer that made each bite sing. Served with buttered noodles, canned corn, or instant mashed potatoes, this was the kind of dinner that came together fast and satisfied everyone at the table. And just when you think ketchup had claimed the crown for best beef topping, the next dish comes sizzling into view with a spoonful of gravy and a name borrowed from something a lot fancier than it turned out to be. Maple sap water, the original sweet cooking liquid, was one of nature's purest gifts and one that Native American communities mastered long before the first colonists ever set foot in North America. In early spring, when the nights were still cold but the days warmed just enough, sap would begin to flow through the veins of maple trees. Native foragers would tap these trees carefully, gathering the clear, slightly sweet liquid that poured out. It was not yet the thick, sticky syrup we think of today. Instead, it was a crisp, refreshing, faintly sweet water that could be drunk straight or used to cook rice, stew, or even brew lightweight, revitalizing teas. To drink maple sap water was to drink hope after a brutal winter. But as delicious as maple was, native chefs had another dark, overlooked ingredient that added both flavor and unexpected health benefits to their meals. And it came straight from the heart of the fire itself. Cabbage and apple skillet was the unexpected pairing that somehow made perfect sense. Sliced apples softened alongside shreds of cabbage in a cast-iron pan, their sweetness blending with a touch of vinegar and the salt of whatever meat was available, often bacon ends or bits of beef. The result was a balance of tart and savory, sweet and smoky. It filled the home with a smell both sharp and comforting, like the promise of something good on a lean day. This dish belonged to families who used what they had, turning orchard fruit and garden cabbage into something memorable. Served alongside bread or potatoes, it brought a little color and cheer to the gray months of winter. Cabbage and apple skillet was not just food. It was proof that frugality could still taste like care, and that even hardship had room for warmth. Ground beef and sweet potato fritters were the original fairground jackpot. Imagine rich, seasoned ground beef folded into a sweet potato batter, then fried up until the edges were crispy and golden. Every bite was this perfect balance of savory and sweet, crunchy and tender, like a county fair and your grandmother's kitchen teamed up for a once-in-a-lifetime collaboration. These fritters were cheap to make, easy to eat standing up, and good enough to make you chase the smell halfway across a dusty summer festival. It was the kind of food that made you forget about prize pigs and pie-eating contests for a minute and just stand there smiling like a fool. And if you think a fritter could stop you in your tracks, wait until you taste a skillet of beef simmered slow in a chokecherry reduction so rich and tangy it could turn a dusty prairie evening into something straight out of a storybook. Hot dog and ground beef skillet was not just a kid-friendly meal. It was dinner in a pinch. You sliced a few hot dogs, browned them with ground beef and chopped onions, then stirred in a can of tomatoes. Maybe some macaroni if you were feeling ambitious. Let it simmer until the sauce thickened. Kids loved the hot dogs. Adults liked that it filled everyone up. Some called it cowboy skillet. Others called it Tuesday. Either way, it stretched two meats into a full meal. No need for sides. Just a fork, a plate, and a few quiet minutes where everyone actually ate. These kinds of dishes showed up in older cookbooks, especially the kind you got free with a cereal box. They were not about impressing anyone, just making do. Gave simple food more depth. It was proof that thrift and flavor could go hand in hand. Layering beef under mashed potatoes was one of those comforting tricks that turned scraps into something special. If there were bits of ground beef left from dinner, Grandma didn't discard them. She layered them into a dish and covered them with fluffy mashed potatoes. Baked in the oven, it transformed into a hearty shepherd's pie that felt like a whole new meal. This trick gave leftovers a second life, while also ensuring that no one left the table hungry. The contrast between the savory beef and creamy potatoes made it a family favorite, even if it began as scraps. For kids, it was simply delicious, while for adults, it was a clever way of making sure the budget stretched further. It showed how resourcefulness could create comfort food that felt intentional and warm. Today, shepherd's pie is still enjoyed, but its origins as a thrifty leftover dish are often forgotten. Back then, it wasn't about style or trend, it was about making the most out of what you had. That practical mindset turned simple ingredients into meals that carried meaning, and that's why dishes like these linger in memory long after they leave the table. Cornmeal-dusted beef patties were the ultimate school lunch heroes back when cafeterias cooked meals from scratch and second helpings were won by speed and charm. Ground beef patties were seasoned simply. A little salt, a little pepper, maybe some onion powder if the lunch ladies were feeling generous, then dredged in cornmeal and fried until the outside got crispy and golden. It gave each patty a hearty crust that kept the juices locked inside, and biting into one was like getting a hug you could taste. Every kid had their own method of attack. Some piled everything into one glorious, messy stack. Others took slow, careful bites to make the moment last. And even though you knew there were better meals out there somewhere, none of them ever tasted quite like home the way these did. If you think that sounds like a trip back to better days, just wait until you hear about a skillet dish from the Great Lakes that blended beef, wild rice, and a little kitchen magic into pure home-style glory. Ground beef shepherd's pie, American style, was the taste of comfort layered in a dish. Beneath the golden crust of mashed potatoes lay a hearty filling of ground beef, cabbage, onions, and vegetables, the kind of mixture that could feed a crowd for little cost. The top browned beautifully, the edges crisping while the inside stayed creamy and soft. Each serving felt like home, rich and warm enough to thaw the coldest evening. It was the kind of dish passed from stove to table without fuss, eaten by families who had earned their meal one long day at a time. The smell alone was enough to draw everyone in, savory, buttery, and full of promise. American shepherd's pie was not born of wealth, but of wisdom. Make what you have, make it last, and make it good. Families would often top it with whatever mash was available, potatoes, turnips, or a mix of both, making every version unique. It was a dish that proved comfort could be built from layers of patience and practicality, turning hardship into something that felt like abundance. Cooking over aromatic wood like cedar was not just about building a fire. It was about infusing every meal with a living, breathing memory of the forest. Cedar, mesquite, alder, and hickory were prized not only for their heat, but for their ability to lend food an unmistakable perfume. Smoky, sweet, slightly bitter, and deeply grounding. Native chefs knew exactly which woods would turn a plain cut of fish or meat into something unforgettable. Fresh salmon might be roasted low over cedar planks, absorbing the wood's oils and scent, while rich game meats might get a kiss of mesquite's sharper bite. These woods were more than fuel. They were ingredients, carefully chosen like spices. And when it came to protecting meats from drying out or burning, native chefs did not just stop at wood. They found a way to wrap their food in the earth itself, locking in flavor with a method so smart it almost feels magical. Doubling portions with cabbage was one of those clever ideas that made a little beef feel like a feast. By shredding cabbage thin and frying it right alongside the ground beef, Grandma turned one modest pound of meat into a skillet brimming with flavor and substance. The cabbage absorbed the drippings, carrying the richness of the beef into every bite, while adding bulk that made plates look generous and complete. What could have been a small meal suddenly became a dish that felt abundant, filling the house with the smell of comfort as it simmered away. This trick also worked quietly to add vegetables into family meals, making them more balanced without anyone noticing. For children, it was simply dinner, but for adults, it was a careful solution to tight budgets. The sizzling pan of beef and cabbage often became the centerpiece of the table, warm and steaming with pride. Even today, beef and cabbage together carry a sense of hominess, proving that resourcefulness was just as powerful as extravagance when it came to feeding a family well. Beef and biscuit ring was the edible version of a kitchen handshake, simple ingredients coming together in a way that felt a little bit fancy. This one was big in the 1950s and 1960s, the kind of dish you made when company was coming over and you wanted something pretty on the table. You would brown up a skillet of ground beef with onions, season it well, and stir in tomato sauce or Worcestershire for a saucy bite. Then came the biscuits, either homemade or straight from a can, no judgment here. You arranged them in a circle on a baking sheet or dish, spooned the beef mixture into the center, and baked until the biscuits puffed up golden and the beef was bubbling away like it had somewhere to be. It was a hit at parties and potlucks alike, and if there was cheese melted on top, forget about it. Plates were wiped clean. But if you really wanted to feel like you were dining at a steakhouse on a hamburger budget, the next dish took things up a notch. Combining beef with lentils or beans was another trick that showed Grandma's genius for stretching protein. A handful of lentils or a can of beans mixed into ground beef doubled the volume and made meals heartier without doubling the cost. The legumes absorbed flavors beautifully, blending right into chilies, soups, or skillet meals. They also added nutrition, making dishes higher in fiber and protein while lowering the overall cost per serving. Families might not have even noticed they were eating less meat because the meals still tasted full and satisfying. This was a practical solution during times when money or rations were tight, but it was also a healthy one. The result was food that felt abundant, even when it wasn't extravagant. Today, the idea of mixing beans into beef is often promoted as modern, but it has deep roots in kitchens that already mastered the art of balance. For Grandma, it wasn't a trend, it was common sense. Every scoop of beans or lentils meant more mouths fed and fewer worries about running out. It was a lesson in how simplicity and ingenuity could create abundance out of scarcity. Ground beef and dried apple. Fry bread pockets were pure, stubborn survival tucked into golden handheld miracles. Ground beef seasoned with whatever was on hand, usually just salt, pepper, and maybe a little nutmeg if you had it, was folded into fry bread dough alongside chopped dried apples, then fried to a crisp, perfect finish. The apples would plump up inside the bread, their tart sweetness cutting through the savory beef like a memory of better days. These pockets were Dust Bowl food, meant to be portable, tough, and nourishing when nothing else was. If you think beef and dried apples sound strange together, just remember, when life gives you dust and sorrow, you bake something worth smiling over. And if you thought that was clever, wait until you hear about the casserole that paired beef, corn, and wild garlic butter in a way so good, it should have been framed and hung on the wall. Ground beef and hominy stew was a blend of necessity and creativity, especially in the American South and Midwest. Hominy, canned or dried corn kernels puffed by lime water, stood in for pasta or rice when neither could be spared. Mixed with ground beef, onions, and a few tomatoes or chili powder, it became a stew both hearty and humble. The texture was unique, chewy, thick, and full of warmth. It was filling enough to feed many mouths and simple enough to make on any night of the week. Some families called it poor man's chili, others just called it dinner. Served steaming with cornbread, it brought a kind of pride, the pride of making something from almost nothing and doing it well. Its scent was rich, earthy, and smoky, carrying through the house long before supper was called. Some cooks added beans for more bulk or diced peppers for flavor, while others relied only on what they could pull from the pantry. Every bowl was a reflection of ingenuity, proving that comfort could rise from even the humblest shelves. The stew was more than sustenance. It was survival seasoned with gratitude. Southwest ground beef and prickly pear tostadas were the edible postcards of the desert. Colorful, a little prickly, and totally unforgettable. Ground beef was seasoned with smoky chilies, cumin, and a squeeze of fresh lime piled high onto crisp tostada shells and crowned with a tangy prickly pear salsa that brought the whole thing to life. If you have never had prickly pear before, it tastes like watermelon, and bubblegum had a baby, with just enough tartness to keep you on your toes. It cut through the rich, savory beef like a song you cannot get out of your head. This was the kind of dish that made people rethink what leftovers could do, stretching a little beef a long way while making it feel like a party on a plate. And if you think a little cactus fruit can transform a simple meal, just wait until you grab a tin cup and sit by the fire for a rugged ragu packed with pine nuts and campfire charm. Old-fashioned stuffed peppers were a triumph of economy. Bell peppers, once cheap and plentiful, became edible bowls for a mix of rice, ground beef, and tomato sauce, the holy trinity of Depression-era kitchens. They baked slowly until the peppers softened and the filling fused into a single, savory heart. The smell of it meant Sunday had arrived, a day when the family gathered and ate together no matter what the week had been. For many, it was the closest thing to celebration they could afford. Colorful, hearty, and proud. Each pepper stood upright in the pan like a promise kept. No one would go hungry tonight. Some cooks added breadcrumbs or leftover vegetables to stretch it further. The result was always the same, a meal that filled the stomach and comforted the soul. Stuffed peppers were proof that creativity was as essential as any ingredient. Honey-glazed beef and roasted acorn medley was the kind of dinner that made you feel like you were living in the richest cabin on the mountain. Ground beef was browned until tender, glazed with a quick mix of wild honey and a splash of vinegar, then spooned over thick wedges of roasted acorn squash. The squash would caramelize around the edges, turning sweet and nutty, soaking up all those beefy, sticky drippings. Every forkful was this perfect mix of sweet, savory, and just a hint of tang, like nature itself was showing off. It was a harvest festival on a plate. No fancy ingredients needed, just a good hot oven and a little bit of patience. And if you thought honey and squash could make magic happen, just wait until you hear how ground beef and dried apples got folded into fry bread pockets tough enough to survive the Dust Bowl, but sweet enough to taste like hope itself. Pre-browning beef before casseroles was one of those small steps that changed the entire character of a dish. Grandma knew that tossing raw beef straight into a bake would leave it greasy, uneven, and heavy. By frying it first, carefully draining the fat, and sometimes seasoning it in the skillet, she created a clean, flavorful base. This simple act gave casseroles a deeper, richer taste, while also keeping the texture balanced so the final dish wasn't soggy or mushy. When paired with pasta, rice, or vegetables, that first step of browning ensured harmony among all the ingredients. Families grew used to casseroles that were hearty but never overwhelming, because technique mattered as much as thrift. It showed that skill in cooking didn't have to be elaborate. It was about respecting each step. Today, many recipes still include this instruction, though people sometimes skip it, forgetting why it mattered. Back then, it was common sense, part of the rhythm of daily cooking, a habit that quietly shaped meals we still remember fondly. Ground beef stew with hickory smoked potatoes was the flavor of comfort when comfort was in short supply. Ground beef was browned nice and slow, not rushed like today's microwave world, and then simmered with chunks of hickory smoked potatoes that tasted like they had been hanging out at a backyard barbecue all day long. The potatoes picked up every bit of beefy, smoky goodness until they practically melted into the stew, making every spoonful thicker, richer, and somehow even more comforting than the last. It was the kind of meal you made when you needed to fill every belly in the house without breaking the bank or spending the whole night hovering over the stove. And if you thought a simple stew could take you right back to the kitchen tables of the 1980s, just wait until you hear about the chili that turned strips of old-school beef jerky into a reservation-style legend with a brand-new twist. Berry-stained smoking cloths were one of the most delicate and poetic techniques in Native American cooking, blending fire, fruit, and smoke into something unforgettable. Thin cloths, sometimes made from woven plant fibers or carefully prepared hides, were soaked in mashed wild berries like blueberries, strawberries, or elderberries. Once stained with the juice, these cloths were wrapped gently around fish, meat, or even roasted roots before being suspended over smoldering fires. As the smoke rose, the berries' natural sugars would slowly caramelize, seeping into the food and layering it with a faint sweetness that tasted like summer itself. And while berry cloths offered sweetness, there was another way Native chefs added rich, subtle layers of flavor to every meal, by mastering the ancient art of infusing oils with the wild herbs that surrounded them. Reservation-style beef jerky chili was one of those dishes that proved you could teach an old dog new tricks, or at least make an old recipe sing a whole new song. Instead of fresh beef, cooks would start with homemade beef jerky, the tough, dried strips getting rehydrated slowly in a bubbling pot of tomatoes, beans, and roasted peppers. The jerky gave the chili a smoky, chewy backbone that regular ground beef just could not match. A big cast-iron pot of jerky chili could feed a whole crew and then some, and there was never a spoon left clean afterward. If you think that sounds like the ultimate use for a handful of old jerky, just wait until you hear about the roasted maize enchiladas that made even the most ordinary dinner feel like a lost celebration worth remembering. Fry-bread beef sliders were the secret weapon at backyard parties before sliders even became a restaurant thing. Imagine little puffs of fresh fry bread, split in half, stacked high with juicy ground beef, seasoned with a wild mix of herbs and just enough kick to make you take notice. These were not your fancy brioche bun sliders either. They had a rustic, crispy bite that somehow made the beef taste even beefier. Toss on a dollop of smoky sauce or a handful of pickled onions if you were feeling fancy, but honestly, nothing beat the classic. Beef, fry bread, and maybe a thin slice of tomato if it was growing in the garden. It was the kind of food that got you running back to the table before the adults could claim the last one. You might think nothing could top biting into one of those crispy, steamy little bundles, but the next dish might just prove otherwise. Which budget-friendly ground beef recipe will you try first? Share your family's favorite stretcher meals in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more delicious trips back to the thriftiest decade in American cooking.